Congratulations, you've just been hired for a job where your resume is one word: small. In Victorian Britain, that's all you needed to secure gainful employment as a chimney sweep. Well, that and a tolerance for soot in every conceivable bodily crevice. Forget health insurance, forget weekends, and definitely forget dignity. What you're signing up for is a profession that's part janitorial service, part spelunking, and part slow-motion self-destruction. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why you wouldn't survive a day as a Victorian chimney sweep, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the obvious question. Why did people need chimney sweeps in the first place? The answer lies in Britain's favourite 19th century pastime, burning things. From the grandest London townhouse to the humblest two-room cottage, fireplaces were the beating heart of every home. You cooked over them, huddled around them for warmth, and occasionally stared into them while contemplating the questionable choices that led you to live in Victorian England. But the real fuel behind the sweeping boom wasn't just wood, it was coal. By the early 1800s, Britain was burning through coal like it was going out of style. Spoiler, it didn't. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood, but it also produced vast quantities of sticky, tar-like soot that clung to chimney walls. Add in narrow flues, some barely larger than a loaf of bread, and you had a recipe for blockages, dangerous smoke build-up and chimney fires. A blocked chimney wasn't just an inconvenience. It could fill your home with toxic fumes faster than you could say, "I think I smell gas." Oh wait, we don't have gas yet. The Industrial Revolution didn't just fill the air with smog, it also filled chimneys with enough soot to make a Victorian sweep's eyes light up like a Dickensian Christmas tree. Urbanization meant more houses crammed together, more fireplaces in use, and more chimneys demanding regular cleaning. Cities like London, Birmingham and Manchester practically choked on their own prosperity. Coal wasn't just powering factories, it was being shoveled into home hearths at a rate that made sweeping a never-ending job. Here's the thing, a chimney wasn't some charming architectural feature. It was the house's lung, and coal soot was the Victorian equivalent of chain smoking. Without regular cleaning, the risk of a chimney fire skyrocketed. Those fires could spread to the wooden beams of the house faster than you could grab your bonnet and bolt for the door. In a city where houses were practically kissing each other across narrow streets, one bad chimney could take out an entire block. Victorian society may have looked down on chimney sweeps, but it also couldn't live without them. Every home with a fireplace needed one. The law even required regular cleaning in some areas, not out of compassion for workers, mind you, but because nobody wanted to explain to the insurance man how their home became an ash pile. Sweeps were part of the unseen machinery that kept the city functional. Much like rat catchers, grave diggers, or that guy who removes dead horses from the street, their work was considered distasteful but absolutely necessary. If you could hold your breath for long stretches and didn't mind looking like you'd been in a fistfight with a coal mine, there was a spot for you in the trade. Victorian chimneys weren't uniform in size or shape. Some twisted and turned like a corkscrew. Others went straight up for several stories, and all of them were coated in layers of black filth that flaked off into your eyes, mouth and hair as you climbed. The longer a chimney went without cleaning, the thicker that layer became, and the harder it was to shift. Imagine trying to scrub dried tar off a tunnel wall using nothing but your hands and a brush, all while dangling inside said tunnel. And this was not optional maintenance. A dirty chimney could kill you in multiple inventive ways: smoke inhalation, accidental suffocation, fire, or in the case of particularly unlucky sweeps, getting stuck and never coming out again. The Victorians had a habit of romanticizing their era, but even Charles Dickens would admit that dying in a chimney wasn't exactly the plot twist anyone wanted. Why would anyone do this job? Simple. There were more chimneys than people willing to clean them. If you were poor, desperate, and small enough to fit inside a chimney flue, congratulations, you were a prime candidate. Wealthy households could afford to hire sweeps regularly, while middle-class homes might scrape together the fee once or twice a year. Either way, it was steady work. If your definition of steady includes sliding down narrow soot-filled shafts in the dark. And the cherry on top? Chimney sweeping was one of those jobs that looked deceptively easy to outsiders. From the street you saw a sweep cheerfully hoisting a brush and singing a tune, or, in reality, coughing violently. But behind the scenes it was a dangerous, physically punishing trade that was already chewing through your health before you hit your teens. So yes, welcome to the soot life. You're part of an indispensable industry, keeping the fires of Victorian Britain burning safely. Just remember, the chimney doesn't care how old you are, how much you weigh, or how badly you need the money. It only cares how much soot it can cram into your lungs before the day is done. The Victorian hiring process was brutally simple. If you could fit in a bread box, you were overqualified. Forget resumes, forget interviews. The only thing a master chimney sweep wanted to know was how small you were, how desperate you were, and how little anyone would notice if you vanished for hours at a time. When Victorians said apprentice, they didn't mean the kind with a nice suit and a career mentor. This wasn't about learning a trade in the hope of one day becoming a prosperous businessman. This was more like signing your childhood away to a man who would send you crawling up soot-filled tunnels for pennies, and that was on a good day. Recruitment was a mix of poverty, tragedy, and opportunism. Many child sweeps were orphans, products of disease epidemics, workhouse neglect, or parents who simply couldn't afford to feed them. Others were sold into the trade by their families, with the fee being a few coins or in some cases a handshake, and the vague promise of food and shelter. And then there were the darker stories. Children snatched from the streets, adopted in name only, and shoved into a job that doubled as a slow-motion death sentence. The chimney sweep's ideal recruit was between 5 and 8 years old, with bones as narrow as their employment prospects. At that age, the human skeleton is flexible enough to twist through the bends of a chimney flue, a skill that adults lacked, and machines at the time couldn't replicate. Older children sometimes got work too, but once you reached a certain size, your value dropped faster than your ability to breathe clean air. Height and weight mattered so much that master sweeps often kept a mental catalogue of street children, noting which ones were small enough to squeeze into awkward spaces. A healthy, well-fed child was actually less desirable than one who looked like a stiff breeze might carry them off. The less you weighed, the more valuable you were, a chilling reversal of how job qualifications should work. The master sweep was the boss, landlord and, in theory, caretaker. In practice, he was often the opposite of nurturing. He owned the brushes, the ladders, the sack of soot-coated rags that doubled as clothing, and for all intents and purposes the child's life. Training was a generous term. On day 1, the child might be shown how to use a small brush. On day 2, they'd be shoved into a chimney and told to start climbing. The first lesson was simple. If you don't make it to the top, you don't get paid. The second lesson was even simpler. No one cares if you're scared. Some masters did make an effort to feed and house their apprentices decently. After all, a sweep who starves to death can't earn you money, but many others saw their charges as replaceable. There was no shortage of children in Victorian slums, and compassion was often in shorter supply than soot. Unlike other professions where tools were meant to help you do the work, chimney sweeping relied heavily on the child's own body. Brushes were helpful, but in narrow or crooked flues, nothing worked as well as human elbows, knees, and sheer determination. The child was the tool, which meant the master's most important job during recruitment was finding the right fit. Literally, some masters even performed impromptu size tests on potential hires, making them squeeze through mock flues or narrow gaps before agreeing to take them on. Passing the test wasn't exactly cause for celebration. It just meant your next crawl would be through a real chimney, and probably hotter, darker, and filthier. The obvious question, why didn't they run away? The answer was bleak. Most had nowhere else to go. Life in the workhouse was worse in many ways. Endless drudgery, meager food, and the looming threat of being separated from any surviving family. On the streets, survival was a daily gamble. And at least with a master sweep, there was a roof, however leaky, and something vaguely edible to eat. There was also a twisted form of pride in the trade. Some children, after years of work, saw themselves as skilled professionals, able to tackle the tightest flues and finish a job faster than anyone else. But make no mistake, the pride came after the bruises, not before. The chimney sweeping industry had a disturbingly efficient turnover rate. Children grew, got too big, or became too ill to work, and there was always another desperate recruit waiting to take their place. This constant cycle kept wages rock bottom and ensured that masters didn't have to worry about investing in their apprentices' well-being. By the mid-1800s, reformers began to campaign against child labour in chimney sweeping, but during the period we're talking about, the recruitment system rolled on like clockwork, or more accurately, like a soot-choked clock that somehow still kept time. So you're 5 years old, scrawny, and without options. A man in a soot-blackened hat offers you a job. He doesn't ask for your name, just your height. You agree because the alternative is hunger, cold, and the workhouse. By tomorrow morning, you'll be climbing inside your first chimney. Your pay? Maybe a crust of bread. Your benefits? The knowledge that for today at least, you're not starving. Congratulations, you've been recruited. And no, you don't get to read the fine print. The workday starts before sunrise because soot is apparently a morning person. By the time most of Victorian London is still blissfully drooling into their pillows, you're already awake, shivering in your soot-stained shirt, and staring down a day's worth of chimneys that want you dead. The first job of the day isn't cleaning chimneys, it's dragging yourself out of whatever passes for a bed. For many sweeps, bed meant a shared, straw-filled sack on the floor of the master's quarters, often still damp from last night's rain or the previous occupant's cough. You're lucky if there's any food before work, maybe a crust of bread or thin porridge, which you'll eat fast because the master is already barking orders. Your uniform is whatever you wore yesterday, which is also what you wore the day before, because laundry isn't on the master's expense list. Your tools, brushes, rods, and scraping implements are bundled up, and you're tasked with carrying them to the first house. If you think Victorian streets were picturesque cobblestone lanes, remember they're also coated in horse manure, rotting food, and mysterious liquids you don't want to identify. By the time you arrive, your boots, if you have any, are already soaked in something unholy. Once inside the house, you don't just waltz up to the chimney. You're greeted, or more often tolerated, by the household staff or the owner. They lead you to the fireplace, which may still be warm from last night's fire. The master checks the flue for blockages with a long brush, then tells you to climb. You drop to your knees, squeeze your shoulders through the narrow opening, and start inching upward in complete darkness. Your elbows and knees become your main tools, digging into the rough brickwork, scraping soot loose as you go. The chimney twists unexpectedly, narrowing to spaces barely wider than your head. You keep climbing because you have to. Stopping means losing your balance or sliding backward into the mess you've just dislodged. The brick walls don't care about your skin. Your forearms get scraped raw, your knees bruise and blister, and fine soot works its way into every scrape, making each cut sting like fire. You can't scratch your face because your hands are black with grime, and besides, moving too much in these tight spaces risks getting wedged. Then there's the breathing. Coal soot isn't polite enough to stay on the walls. Every movement sends a cloud into your lungs, coating your throat and making you cough, which is terrible, because coughing in a tight flue means losing precious oxygen. Reaching the top doesn't come with fanfare. You just know you've made it because your head hits daylight, your lungs gulp fresh air, and you feel wind chill you didn't even know you missed. Then it's back down again, often faster, as you slide or scramble, and once you emerge, you're covered in soot from head to toe, looking like you lost a fight with a volcano, but there's no time to celebrate. You wipe your eyes, collect the tools, and move on to the next house. A working day for a Victorian chimney sweep meant multiple houses, sometimes a dozen in a single day. There's no break between jobs unless you count the time spent walking from one location to another. Meals, if they happen, are crammed into odd moments. A a stolen apple, a scrap of bread eaten while trudging to the next chimney. The master keeps track of the schedule, and his patience is as thin as your lunch. Slow work means less profit, so you're hustled along whether you're exhausted, injured, or still hacking up coal dust from the last climb. By midday, the physical toll is obvious. Your knees are rubbed raw, your shoulders ache from forcing yourself through narrow bends, and your throat feels like you've been swallowing sandpaper. But there's still work to be done, and in Victorian London, overtime isn't a bonus. It's just the normal end to your day. In the afternoon, jobs get harder. Flues are sometimes older and more fragile, with crumbling mortar and awkward bends that test your flexibility and patience. Some chimneys even have animal nests inside, birds, squirrels, or if you're truly unlucky, something long dead. Removing them is part of the gig, and no one thanks you for it. As evening falls, you trudge back to the master's lodging, tools in hand, skin and clothes stiff with dried soot. If you're lucky, there's food waiting. If not, you collapse into your straw sack, hungry, exhausted, and smelling like a human fireplace. Even then, the day's not entirely over. Sometimes the master sends you out again for urgent work. A rich household demanding a last-minute cleaning before a dinner party, or a panicked tenant worried about a fire hazard. By the time you finally sleep, your body aches in places you didn't know existed. Your lungs feel heavy, and you're already dreading the next morning. The cycle never changes, except for the days when it gets worse, but that's a story for later chapters. So yes, the daily grind for a Victorian chimney sweep was as much about endurance as it was about skill. You weren't just climbing chimneys, you were wrestling them, one scraped knee at a time. And if you thought soot was the worst part of the job, you haven't met the smell yet. It's like spelunking, but instead of discovering ancient caves, you find dust older than your grandmother. The Victorian chimney was not some quaint brick tube. It was a labyrinth designed with absolutely no consideration for the humans who would have to crawl through it. Imagine a cramped, airless tunnel barely wider than your shoulders, twisting upward into darkness. That's your new office, and the only ergonomic feature it has is that it's perfectly shaped to bruise every bone in your body. The moment you squeeze in, the light disappears. Daylight from the fireplace opening vanishes after the first bend, and your eyes adjust to a blackness so complete that it swallows your sense of direction. You know which way is up, only because gravity keeps pulling you down, a constant reminder that if you slip, you're going to tumble into a heap of soot and regret at the bottom. The air is heavy, as if someone poured coal dust into every breath you take. You try to breathe shallowly, but the exertion forces deeper gulps, dragging more soot into your lungs with each movement. Inside, the walls are rough and unyielding. Victorian chimney bricks were often set with protruding mortar or jagged edges that caught at clothing, scraped skin and snagged hair. Each movement of your elbows and knees is like grinding sandpaper over your own body. You can feel layers of soot crumble away beneath your touch, not in satisfying chunks, but in clouds that coat your mouth and sting your eyes. The particles are fine enough to get past your eyelashes and lodge in your tear ducts, turning every blink into a gritty scratch. Temperature is its own problem. In the summer, the bricks absorb heat from the sun and radiate it inward, making the chimney feel like a claustrophobic oven. In winter, the flue may be icy and damp, with condensation dripping down the walls to soak into your clothing. If the household lit a fire earlier in the day and didn't wait long enough for it to die out, you could be crawling into a space still radiating heat, the bricks uncomfortably warm against your skin. In the worst cases, stray embers could still be glowing, a literal hot seat, except you're sitting, kneeling and crawling all at once. And then there's the architecture. Victorian chimneys were rarely straight vertical shafts. They often bent at odd angles to accommodate the layout of the house. Some twisted sharply, requiring sweeps to wedge an arm or leg into awkward positions to pull themselves through. Others narrowed unexpectedly, leaving you stuck mid-climb. Getting wedged wasn't just embarrassing, it was life-threatening. Panic set in quickly when you realized you couldn't go up or down, and the more you struggled, the more exhausted you became, even with a master sweep outside trying to guide you. Rescue wasn't guaranteed. Many children suffocated in place, their bodies only retrieved after the chimney was dismantled brick by brick. Falling was another constant danger. Climbing required bracing yourself against the walls, but one slip could send you tumbling. If you were lucky, you landed in the fireplace with only bruises. If you weren't, you'd hit protrusions on the way down, breaking bones before you even reached the bottom. And because soot is a slippery substance, especially when mixed with moisture, losing your footing was easier than you'd like to believe. Even if you avoided the big hazards, the small ones were relentless. Birds loved to nest in chimneys, and if you startled one while climbing, you'd get a flurry of wings, claws, and panicked flapping in your face. Squirrels occasionally turned up too, along with insects that had taken up residence in the warm, sheltered flue. Then there were the corpses, not human ones, hopefully, but the remains of animals that had fallen in and couldn't get out. Finding one meant you had to clear it out along with the soot, all while pressed against a wall in near total darkness. The smell was its own special punishment. It wasn't just smoke, it was the concentrated scent of years' worth of burning coal, mixed with damp brick, animal remains, and whatever household refuse had drifted into the chimney. Some flues smelled faintly of roasting meat from the kitchen fireplace. Others reeked of chemical fumes if the owners had burned trash to get rid of it. Once you absorbed that odor into your clothes and skin, it clung to you for days no matter how much you tried to wash. And yet you had to keep moving. Staying still meant breathing in stagnant soot-filled air, and that was almost as dangerous as falling. Your body ached from bracing against the walls, but there was no comfortable position to rest in. You learned to crawl quickly and efficiently, not just to get the job done, but to get out before the chimney itself defeated you. This was the Victorian Chimney Sweep's workspace, cramped, filthy and dangerous. Every climb was a gamble with suffocation, falls, burns or getting stuck. There were no safety rails, no ventilation systems, and no guarantee you'd see daylight again once you went in. And yet for a child sweep, this wasn't an occasional ordeal. It was the daily reality, repeated over and over, until your body broke down or you grew too big to fit inside. The first thing you need to know about soot is that it doesn't just sit on you. It moves in. It works its way into every pore, every hair follicle, every scrap of fabric you own, and then it throws away the key. Chimney sweeps in Victorian England didn't just look like they had rolled in a coal pile, they smelled like it too. The scent was a pungent blend of burnt creosote, wet ash, and the faint tang of sweat from hours of crawling through a chimney's intestines. It wasn't the sort of odor you noticed when you first picked up your brush and scraper in the morning. No, this was the kind of smell that set up camp on your skin and decided to raise a family there. Bathing, of course, was the obvious solution, except that bathing in the working-class districts of Victorian cities was not exactly a daily occurrence. For one thing, running water was a luxury for the wealthy. Most working-class homes relied on public pumps, which meant carting buckets of cold water up narrow staircases just for the privilege of splashing your face. Hot water that required either a kettle on the stove or a miracle. A full bath might involve a tin tub in the middle of the kitchen once a week, if that. And in a house full of people, you might not even be the first to use it. By the time your turn came, the water was less refreshing and more murky soup of other people's dirt. This meant that for chimney sweeps, the daily routine of scrubbing off the grime was often replaced by simply shaking off the loose soot and calling it good. You'd wipe your hands on your trousers, never mind that your trousers were already blackened, and maybe rinse your face at the pump if you were feeling fancy. Soap, when it was used, was the coarse brown variety made from animal fat and lye, and it was better at drying your skin into parchment than making you smell pleasant. Even if you did manage a decent scrub, the smell of burnt soot had a way of surviving the ordeal. Your hair would still reek, your nails would still have black crescents, and your clothes, well, your clothes were a lost cause. Speaking of clothes, chimney sweeps rarely had more than one set of work garments. That meant you'd wear the same soot-saturated shirt and trousers day after day, week after week, until the fabric was less cotton and more compressed ash. The scent of your uniform became part of your personal brand. the way a fine cologne might for a gentleman, except instead of sandalwood and bergamot, yours was more chimney fire aftermath. Even if you changed clothes, the soot in your hair and under your skin would betray you. This wasn't just a cosmetic problem, it was social. You didn't just smell to yourself, you smelled to everyone within a 6-foot radius, which in crowded Victorian streets meant pretty much everyone. People would cross to the other side of the road when you passed, not because they feared pickpockets, but because they feared their noses. The good news, as sweeps sometimes joked, was that the smell acted as a natural security system. No thief wanted to rifle through your pockets and leave smelling like the inside of a chimney. The bad news, if you wanted to talk to someone without them covering their nose, you were out of luck. The smell wasn't just something you carried into your personal life, it followed you everywhere. To the pub, where you'd add to the general fugue of stale beer and pipe smoke. To church, where you'd sit in the back because the lady in the next pew kept dabbing at her nose with a handkerchief. Even to bed, where the scent of soot seeped into the sheets, ensuring that you woke up smelling exactly as you had the day before. Your pillow, it didn't just hold your head, it was a sponge for chimney dust. Over time, the body itself seemed to absorb the smell. Skin oils mixed with soot to form a kind of permanent patina. Hair, especially if it was rarely washed, developed a texture that was equal parts grease and grit. Fingernails were a record of every day's work, a dark archive of your climb through London's flues. Some sweeps swore the smell never really left them, even after they'd retired from the trade. It clung to them like an old friend who refused to take the hint. There were, of course, occasional attempts to mask the odour, a dab of cheap cologne from the market, perhaps, or rubbing lavender leaves between the hands. But these were temporary solutions, like tossing a doily over a pig. Within minutes of crawling into another chimney, the scent of the flowers was bulldozed by the smell of burnt creosote. In truth, the smell was more than just a nuisance. It was a badge of the trade, an invisible uniform that identified you before you even opened your mouth. If there was any silver lining, it was that among other sweeps nobody noticed. When everyone smells like the aftermath of a fire, the stench becomes the background music of your social life. You could lean in close to tell a story without worrying about offending anyone, because if you were a sweep, you couldn't smell it anymore either. Your nose had given up, just like your knees and your lungs, and so the smell you couldn't wash off became part of the identity. You didn't just work in soot, you lived in it. It seeped into your skin, your clothes, your relationships, and even your dreams. And if you were lucky, you only carried it with you for a lifetime, instead of taking it with you to the grave, though given the state of Victorian coffins, chances are it lingered there too. Let's be clear. If you were a Victorian chimney sweep, the air you breathed wasn't air. It was an unholy cocktail of ash, smoke, and microscopic flecks of soot swirling around like snow in a Dickensian nightmare. Except this snow burned your throat, blackened your teeth, and settled deep into your lungs where it took up permanent residency. Each time you shimmied up a chimney, you weren't just cleaning someone's heating system. You were marinating your respiratory tract in the byproducts of incomplete combustion. And this was no harmless dust. Coal soot is laced with toxins, sulfur, arsenic, lead, making every breath a little act of self-poisoning. The most immediate symptom was the sweep's cough, a dry soundtrack to your daily life. It was your body's feeble attempt to evict the soot, which stubbornly refused to leave. Over time, that cough deepened into wheezing and shortness of breath, a condition we might call chronic bronchitis today. But the Victorians didn't need modern terminology to know something was wrong. You could hear it in the way sweeps struggled to catch a breath after just a few steps. And then there was asthma, or what they sometimes referred to as chest tightness or smoke asthma. Imagine climbing a chimney, wedged in so tightly your ribs could barely expand, while your lungs seized up from inhaling particles sharp enough to score their lining. The irony was cruel. A job requiring you to wriggle and climb like a cat demanded lungs that, over time, the job itself destroyed. But the most infamous occupational curse of the trade was something far darker: chimney sweep's carcinoma, the first recorded industrial cancer in history. In 1775, Long before Victorian England hit its industrial stride, a surgeon named Percival Pott identified the disease in chimney sweeps. He noticed that boys who had spent their youth cleaning flues often developed malignant tumours in adulthood, particularly in an area the Victorians would have delicately referred to as down there. The cause? Soot lodging in the folds of the skin, especially when boys worked unclothed or nearly naked to fit through tight spaces without proper washing, which few could afford or even considered. Carcinogens in soot could remain in contact with the skin for years, slowly turning healthy tissue cancerous. It was a slow-motion tragedy, the kind you could trace back to the very first chimney you ever climbed. Of course, the risks didn't stop with the lungs or the skin. Soot particles entering the bloodstream could cause systemic inflammation, leading to weakness, fevers, and a general sense of malaise that no one in the 19th century would have called occupational health, but simply being a sweep. Eyes, too, were under siege. Constant exposure to smoke and dust led to chronic irritation, bloodshot eyes, and in some cases partial blindness. After all, when you're working in pitch black, rubbing soot out of your eyes with soot-covered fingers, you're basically giving yourself an abrasive scrub worthy of a blacksmith's workshop. And then there was the issue of burns. Chimneys weren't always cold when sweeps climbed them. If a household was impatient or simply didn't care, they might send you up while embers still glowed. One slip, one misjudged push, and your skin could meet heated brick or stray sparks. Burns might heal, but soot could infiltrate the wound, turning minor injuries into long-term infections. Without antibiotics, an infected burn could be as deadly as the cancers and lung diseases that took sweeps in later years. The grim truth was that there was no safe level of exposure. Even on your best day, maybe the chimney was wide, the climb was quick, the soot was light, you were still inhaling poisons, and you were doing it over and over again, sometimes multiple chimneys a day, 6 days a week for years. It wasn't just an occupation, it was a slow surrender to invisible enemies you couldn't escape, and yet the danger was normalized. People spoke of sweeps in the same tone they spoke of miners or factory hands. Tough work, but someone had to do it. The difference was that miners, at least, had the occasional fresh air walk to and from the pit. Sweeps lived their lives between blackened walls, their lungs shrinking with each passing year. By the time symptoms became impossible to ignore, the damage was already irreversible. The dark irony: many Victorians believed that soot had health benefits. Some thought it warded off colds, others claimed it purified the air inside homes by removing harmful vapors. Of course, they were only half right. Soot did remove certain odors from the air. It just replaced them with a slow-acting chemical assault on anyone unlucky enough to breathe it. The result was an industry where the very work that fed you was quietly killing you. Every cough, every breathless climb, every irritated eye was a reminder that the hazards weren't just workplace risks. They were baked into the profession itself. And unlike today's dangerous jobs, there was no safety gear, no protective mask, no union to demand cleaner air. All you had was your lungs, and with each passing day they belonged less to you and more to the soot. If you're imagining chimney sweeping as a fast track to Victorian riches, let me ruin that dream now. The pay wasn't just low, it was insultingly low, the sort of wage that could barely keep you alive, let alone buy you anything that might make life pleasant. Many sweeps, especially the young ones, weren't even technically paid in the way you'd think. Instead, they were given food, often the cheapest, greasiest scraps available, a corner of a floor to sleep on, and the dubious privilege of not being beaten quite as much as the other apprentices. For children, the arrangement often resembled indentured servitude. Orphanages, workhouses, and even desperate parents would hand over boys as young as 6 to master sweeps, sometimes for a small fee up front. The master now owned the child's labor and the child's life until they were too big to fit in chimneys. This wasn't an apprenticeship in the modern sense, where you learn a trade and eventually earn a decent wage. This was a long-term lease on your tiny body for the purpose of squeezing it into soot-coated tubes, a business model not exactly endorsed by career counselors. For the sweeps who were considered paid, the rate might be a few pence per job. But since most of that went to the master sweep, you were left with a handful of coins, not enough for new clothes, not enough for proper food, and certainly not enough for savings. And forget weekends or days off. Chimney sweeping was a seasonal job in some places, with the busiest times in autumn and winter, when households needed fires most. The rest of the year, you might be scavenging odd jobs to avoid starvation, often while still living under the master's roof and still being charged for food and lodging. Yes, that's right. Many sweeps were effectively in debt to the very people they worked for. The master would keep a running tally, how much you owed for bread, for a place to sleep, for work clothes, which were usually just rags, even for the tools you used. You could work for years and still owe money, which is a neat trick if you're the one writing the ledger and making sure the debt is never truly cleared. And what about perks? In the loosest possible sense, you might consider survival a perk. You did get to see interesting parts of town, from grand manor houses to crowded urban terraces, but you weren't sightseeing. You were there to shimmy up flues and scrape away soot, while inhaling enough carcinogens to qualify as a walking medical experiment. Sometimes the bonus was being given leftover coal to sell for extra cash, which meant spending your evening hauling sacks of dirty fuel through the streets like a miniature coal merchant. In rare cases, a sweep who survived long enough could eventually become a master himself. This was not so much a promotion, as it was moving from the frying pan into a slightly bigger frying pan where you could now underpay your own crew of child sweeps. But the barriers to entry were steep. You needed equipment, contacts with homeowners, and often a license, which meant a large upfront cost most sweeps could never hope to afford. And then there was the social side of the job, or rather the lack of it. Chimney sweeps were not considered glamorous members of Victorian society. In fact, they ranked just above beggars in public esteem. Many people saw sweeps as little more than soot-covered nuisances, their ragged appearance and perpetual cough marking them as part of the invisible underclass. This meant fewer opportunities to marry well, make influential friends, or escape the social pigeonhole you were born into. The job didn't just keep you poor, it kept you poor in the eyes of everyone else. Of course, the Victorians loved a good myth about earning your keep through hard work, and chimney sweeping was often romanticized in art and literature. But the reality was a grinding, thankless existence where the financial ladder was broken from the bottom rung up. You worked, you coughed, you got paid just enough to keep going, and you stayed in the same soot-blackened corner of society until your body gave out. The funny angle? This wasn't a career path at all, it was more of a career crawl. Literally, you weren't climbing the corporate ladder, you were wedged in a brick shaft scraping filth off the walls, hoping to be given enough stale bread to do it all again tomorrow. If the perk of a job is that you technically haven't died yet, it's not exactly the kind of position you'll see advertised in the Victorian classifieds. In the great hierarchy of Victorian society, chimney sweeps occupied a spot so far down the ladder it's debatable whether they were actually on it at all. Imagine a pyramid, aristocrats perched at the gleaming top, respectable tradesmen holding the middle, and down at the very bottom, wedged somewhere between beggars and the street's resident stray dog, you'd find the sweeps, and the dog frankly might have had better PR. For much of the 19th century, sweeps were seen as necessary but undesirable. People appreciated clean chimneys because it meant fewer fires and more efficient heating. However, no one wanted to dwell too long on the fact that those spotless chimneys had been achieved by a soot-covered child crawling inside them. Sweeps carried with them the unmistakable mark of their profession. Literally, even if they weren't currently working, the stubborn black residue in the pores of their skin gave them away. No amount of scrubbing could erase the uniform that nature had bestowed upon them. To the upper and middle classes, chimney sweeps embodied the grimy underbelly of urban life, the part everyone knew existed but preferred not to think about. They were tolerated in a strictly transactional way, welcome at the front door only when soot levels were approaching fire hazard, and hustled away the moment the job was done. There was rarely any casual chit-chat, no lingering over tea. You could spend hours inside someone's home and still not be considered part of the domestic scene. as if the sweep and the parlour were two incompatible realities that must never overlap. Among the working poor, the perception was more complicated. Other labourers often pitied sweeps, especially the younger ones, for enduring one of the most dangerous and degrading jobs available. But pity didn't necessarily translate into friendship or solidarity. Soot clung not just to skin but to clothing and belongings, making sweeps conspicuous and unfortunately smelly. Socializing with one meant accepting the risk of walking home with your own dusting of chimney residue. Victorian morality added another twist to the sweep's low status. Many reformers and social commentators framed chimney sweeping as a sad byproduct of industrial capitalism's worst excesses: child labour, unsafe working conditions and urban poverty rolled into one grim package. Campaigners like Lord Shaftesbury fought for regulations to protect sweeps, particularly children, and public opinion did slowly shift. However, the shift was more about condemning the system than elevating the individuals within it. Sweeps might be rescued from their profession, but they weren't being invited into drawing rooms for polite society's soirees. For the sweep, the worst part of their public image was the suspicion that they were somehow less clean morally as well as physically. In a society that equated cleanliness with virtue, a soot-covered body was easily conflated with a sullied character. This was especially harsh for children, who had little say in their circumstances, yet were branded as rough, ill-mannered and untrustworthy simply because of their appearance. It didn't matter if they were polite, honest and hard-working. The black streaks on their skin told a story the public had already decided on. Popular culture didn't help much. While nursery rhymes like The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake and various folk songs occasionally portrayed sweeps as plucky survivors, most depictions leaned toward caricature. The sweep became a symbol of poverty, grime, and servitude, a stock figure in street scenes rather than a fully human character. Ironically, this caricature outlived the actual profession. Even decades after mechanized brushes replaced most child sweeps, the stereotype lingered, preserved in Victorian illustrations and melodramas, and yet there was a strange paradox to their status. In some regions, particularly rural areas or smaller towns, sweeps carried a peculiar form of good luck charm reputation. Weddings, for instance, sometimes featured the appearance of a sweep who was paid to shake hands with the bride for good fortune. This superstition was a rare, fleeting moment when the sweep's presence was actively sought out, not for a dirty job, but as a symbol of prosperity. Of course, it still didn't mean they'd be invited to the wedding feast afterward. Being sooty wasn't simply a physical condition, it was a social identity that was almost impossible to wash off. Even sweeps who left the profession often struggled to escape its stigma, the accent, the posture from years of crawling in tight spaces, and the lingering discoloration on skin and nails marked them as former sweeps. In a society obsessed with class boundaries, those marks acted like invisible fences keeping them from upward mobility. In short, being a chimney sweep in Victorian England meant living at the intersection of necessity and neglect. People needed you, but they didn't want you. You were a tool, not a neighbour, a service provider, not a guest. The good news? You were technically employed. The bad news? On the respect ladder, you were still one rung below the family dog, and at least the dog got to sit by the fire instead of cleaning it. By the mid-19th century, Britain's conscience, though often delayed, finally started twitching at the thought of children coughing their lungs out in dark, claustrophobic chimneys. The Industrial Revolution was marching along, cities were expanding, and a growing middle class was beginning to notice that maybe, just maybe, forcing an 8-year-old to scrub soot off bricks in a fire shaft wasn't the pinnacle of civilized progress. Enter the era of reform, or at least the era where people began talking about reform while still lighting fires that sent more soot up for those kids to scrape away. One of the most vocal champions of change was Lord Shaftesbury, a man whose full name, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, sounded like someone born to host dinner parties, not storm Parliament over child labour laws. But he was relentless. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, Shaftesbury pushed for legislation to protect chimney sweeps, particularly the smallest ones who could barely carry the brushes taller than themselves. His argument was simple. This was barbaric, dangerous, and here's the kicker, completely unnecessary thanks to new mechanical cleaning devices. The first significant attempt to protect child sweeps came with the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834. It was supposed to limit the age of apprentices to over 10 years old. In practice, this was about as effective as asking a cat politely not to sit on your laptop. There were no real enforcement mechanisms, so many masters just lied about their apprentices' ages, or ignored the law entirely. And so the reform treadmill began. Laws were passed, ignored, and rewritten. By the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1840, Parliament got bolder. It outright prohibited anyone under 21 from climbing chimneys. Now, this sounded like real progress until you realized there were still no meaningful inspections. If a master wanted to send a child up a chimney, all they had to do was not advertise it to the local magistrate. And since children were not exactly filing workplace complaints in the Victorian era, the law was more moral suggestion than mandate. Meanwhile, technology was providing alternatives. Inventors developed long, jointed rods with bristled heads that could be pushed up or pulled down a chimney to dislodge soot. No small boys required. The trouble, they weren't as versatile as a living, squirming human body. Rods couldn't easily navigate the crooked, twisting flues of older buildings. In some cases, the brush would miss spots, meaning the chimney might still catch fire, a risk no homeowner wanted to take. For many masters, the choice between guaranteed clean with a child and probably clean with a machine was easy. Masters also had a financial reason to resist change. A brush cost money up front. A child could be purchased as an apprentice for little to nothing, and then worked for years in exchange for minimal food and shelter. Plus, as cruel as it sounds, a child could be replaced if something happened to them. A brush, on the other hand, had to be repaired or replaced with actual cash. Reformers tried to fight this thinking with a mix of moral outrage and practical demonstration. Shaftesbury and others staged public cleanings with mechanical devices to show they could be effective. Newspapers ran horror stories about children suffocating or being burned alive in chimneys, hoping to shock the public into action. The strategy worked. Sort of. By the time the Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act of 1864 came around, there were inspectors tasked with enforcing the law. Fines could be levied on masters who still used child labor, and yet, even then, the practice didn't die overnight. In rural areas and poorer urban neighborhoods, child sweeps continued to be used well into the late 19th century. Some families were desperate enough to offer their children for the work despite the risks, reasoning that a miserable job was better than starvation. In certain trades, tradition dies harder than soot on a flue. The final legal nail in the coffin came with the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, which required all sweeps to be licensed and placed real legal teeth behind enforcement. Masters could face imprisonment if caught employing underage climbers. By then, mechanical cleaning technology had improved enough to handle even the trickiest chimneys. The job still wasn't glamorous, but at least it didn't require sacrificing children to the cause. Of course, the shift didn't mean Victorian society suddenly saw sweeps as heroic figures. The reform movement was less about elevating the trade's social standing and more about removing the most visibly horrifying parts of it. In other words, the attitude was, we'll stop sending kids up chimneys, but you adults can still knock yourselves out, literally, if there's a loose brick. In the end, the fight for chimney sweep reform was a microcosm of the Victorian reform era as a whole. Part moral awakening, part technological advancement, and part begrudging compromise with centuries of ingrained habit. Change came slowly, with every step forward meeting resistance from those clinging to the old ways. But eventually, children could look forward to futures that didn't involve wedging themselves into soot-coated tubes for a living. Funny enough, the mechanical sweeps that replaced them never once demanded better wages, a warm bed, or boots without holes, making them a Victorian employer's dream. They just couldn't sing cheerful work songs in the soot, which, depending on your perspective, was either a loss for cultural charm or a gain for lung health. By the late 19th century, The profession of the human chimney sweep was slowly being swept away, and for once, nobody was complaining except the chimney sweep masters who missed the free labor. The combination of social reform, new building standards, and the spread of mechanical brushes meant that squeezing a child into a flue was no longer necessary, just exploitative. Parliament had passed multiple chimney sweepers acts, and by the 1870s the practice of sending children up chimneys had become illegal, at least on paper. In reality, enforcement took a while, because tradition is a stubborn thing, especially when tradition is cheap. The Industrial Revolution was the final nail in the soot-stained coffin. New heating methods, closed stoves, larger flues, and even early central heating systems made the job of climbing into a chimney both less practical and less profitable. Why hire a boy to wriggle into a sooty death trap when a long-handled brush could do the job without risking a police fine or a newspaper scandal? In many urban areas, sweeping became an adult's trade, still dirty, still dangerous, but no longer requiring a workforce the size of a Victorian orphanage. Yet, like most outdated jobs, chimney sweeping didn't vanish overnight. In smaller towns and rural estates, sweeps clung on, their trade passed down like a family heirloom nobody actually wanted. These men, and by then sometimes women, adapted to the times, offering not just chimney cleaning but also furnace maintenance and general household repair. They were the early jack-of-all-trades handymen, except they still left a trail of black smudges wherever they went. The cultural memory of chimney sweeps, however, did not disappear with the soot. In fact, it became strangely romanticized. Take the famous nursery rhyme, The Chimney Sweeper, or better yet, Mary Poppins, which managed to transform the Victorian sweeper from a half-starved orphan into a charming, soot-dusted song and dance man. Hollywood replaced coughing fits with cheerful chorus lines, swapped soot for harmless black makeup, and instead of frostbite, sweeps got magical penguin friends. It was less history and more fantasy, the kind that made audiences feel nostalgic for a job they would never actually want. In Britain, sweeps even took on an odd superstition-driven role. They became considered good luck at weddings. Some traditions claimed that if a bride saw a chimney sweep on her wedding day, her marriage would be blessed with happiness and prosperity. This might have been because they were rare by the 20th century, or maybe because everyone just liked the idea of brushing a bit of soot off before starting a new life. Either way, Victorian reality was long gone. The public image of the sweep had been scrubbed clean and polished until only the quaint charm remained. But the lingering soot of history is stubborn. In old industrial towns, the black stains on brickwork and the respiratory damage suffered by former sweeps remained as reminders of what the job really entailed. The decline of chimney sweeping was undeniably a win for public health, yet it also underscored a truth about progress. We rarely retire a profession until something more profitable comes along to replace it. Today, chimney sweeps still exist, though they are more likely to arrive in a van than with a soot bag slung over their shoulder. Their work involves inspecting modern flues, cleaning wood stove chimneys, and occasionally rescuing the odd trapped bird. They wear protective gear and use motorized brushes. No climbing into flues, no coughing up coal dust for days. The job has been tamed, sanitized, and safely slotted into the world of licensed trades. The sweep's legacy in popular culture, however, remains far dustier than the actual work. Films, children's books, and even seasonal greeting cards keep painting sweeps as whimsical figures in top hats with cheeky smiles, a vision that would have baffled the starving, frost-bitten boys of the 1820s. And that's perhaps the biggest twist in the chimney sweep's story. The dirtier the reality was, the cleaner history has tried to make it look. In the end, the sweep's profession may have been phased out, but the image of the sooty worker clinging to a rooftop, brush in hand, endures. Just remember, in the movie version, you sing with penguins. In reality, you cough with pigeons. When Emperor Justinian I decided he wanted to build the greatest church in the world, he wasn't messing around. The year was 537 AD, and the Byzantine Empire was flexing its muscles politically, militarily, and apparently architecturally. Justinian's vision for Hagia Sophia was nothing short of a divine flex, a building so enormous, so grand, that it could make mere mortals stop and stare, or at least shield their eyes from the glare of all that marble. Why build such a massive cathedral? Well, the Byzantine Empire was the heir to the Roman Empire's legacy, and Justinian wanted to showcase the empire's glory, not just with armies or laws, but with architecture that screamed power and faith simultaneously. Imagine announcing, "We're not just strong, we're wholly strong," but with bricks and mortar instead of swords. To get this done, Justinian pulled out all the stops. He drafted two top-notch architects, Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and physicist, and Isidore of Miletus, a geometer and engineer. These guys were the original Renaissance men of the 6th century, though maybe with slightly less glamorous haircuts. Their mission? To create a building so innovative, it would still amaze people more than 1400 years later, and boy did they deliver. The centerpiece of Hagia Sophia was its massive dome, spanning roughly 31 meters, about 102 feet in diameter, a staggering feat of engineering for the time. The dome didn't just sit flat on the building, it appeared to float above the nave, supported by a clever system of pendentives, architectural triangles that gently eased the round dome onto a square base. If you have no idea what a pendentive is, don't worry. Even architects back then were probably whispering prayers, hoping the whole thing wouldn't come crashing down. Here's a fun mental image. Imagine Justinian's contractors, sweat dripping into their eyes, lifting stone blocks as if they were oversized Lego pieces, all while the emperor paced nervously, occasionally yelling, "More marble, make it grander," was probably more stressful than any gladiator match in the Colosseum, and a lot less bloody, thankfully. The interior was another story. The walls were lavishly covered in marble of all colors, and gold mosaics glittered under the light filtering through hundreds of windows. The craftsmanship was so exquisite that visitors reportedly felt like they were stepping into heaven itself. Some even described the dome as a golden cloud, suspended in mid-air with light bouncing off every surface. Talk about atmosphere goals. But it wasn't just about looks. The Hagia Sophia was designed to inspire awe, to lift the spirits of worshippers and visitors alike. The combination of scale, light, and decoration created an experience unlike anything else in the world at the time. It was more than a building. It was a physical manifestation of divine power, a reminder that the emperor ruled not just over men but also under the watchful eye of God. Of course, the speed of construction was nothing short of miraculous too. The entire building rose in just under 6 years, a blink of an eye considering modern cathedrals sometimes take centuries. This rapid pace meant a massive workforce of laborers, artisans and slaves, all coordinated under tight deadlines. You can imagine the site buzzing with activity, the constant clatter of chisels, the shouts of foremen, and the occasional "Hey, watch out with that marble slab." But let's not forget the political backdrop. Justinian wasn't just building a church, he was sending a message to the world. This was an empire that, despite countless wars, plagues, and rebellions, could still rally its people and resources to create something timeless. Hagia Sophia was a power play disguised as a house of worship, and a power play it was. The church was consecrated on December 27, 537 AD, with Justinian famously proclaiming, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," a direct reference to the biblical Temple of Solomon, which had long been the benchmark for sacred architecture. High praise, and a clear declaration that Hagia Sophia wasn't just a building, it was a legacy. All in all, the birth of Hagia Sophia wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about ambition, faith, innovation, and a fair share of imperial swagger. The kind of project that makes you want to pause, look up, and think, wow, someone really wanted to impress the heavens and they nailed it. So next time you picture this colossal marvel, remember, it was a building so big and fancy, it probably made Justinian's contractors sweat harder than gladiators. And that's saying something, because gladiators didn't just sweat, they bled. If there's one thing the Hagia Sophia has never been short of, it's drama, and not just the political or religious kind. No, this magnificent structure has faced a relentless natural foe for centuries: earthquakes. Mother Nature seemed to have a personal grudge against Justinian's masterpiece, shaking and rattling it with such frequency and ferocity that you'd think Hagia Sophia was the empire's favorite wrecking ball target. You see, Constantinople, perched precariously near several fault lines, was a hotspot for seismic activity. So soon after its grand completion in 537 AD, Hagia Sophia began to reveal a less glamorous side of architectural fame. It was shockingly vulnerable to tremors. Just months after the church was consecrated, an earthquake struck and caused the original dome to collapse spectacularly. Talk about a short-lived glory. Imagine the emperor's dismay. My grand dome, my golden cloud, reduced to rubble. But the story didn't end there. This wasn't a one-off fluke. Over the next 2 centuries, multiple earthquakes would shake Hagia Sophia like a toddler with a snow globe. The great dome came crashing down twice more, each time necessitating not just repairs but rebuilding, an expensive, daunting, and downright dangerous task. At this point you might be thinking, didn't they consider building somewhere less earthquake-prone? But no, the site was sacred, the city's heart, and the empire's pride. Moving wasn't an option. Instead, Byzantine architects and engineers faced an ongoing challenge: how to keep the grand dome afloat, literally, without it collapsing again. Enter Isidore the Younger, nephew of the original architect Isidore of Miletus. He was charged with repairing and redesigning the dome after the devastating quake of 558 AD. His approach was ingenious. He made the dome taller and steeper, which helped distribute the weight more effectively and reduced the lateral forces that had contributed to the earlier collapses. Think of it like redesigning a tent to withstand a windstorm, only with stones and mortar instead of canvas and poles. But here's where the engineering creativity really kicks in. Since Hagia Sophia was already built, they couldn't just rebuild from scratch. They had to work with what was there, which meant shoring up the structure with additional supports. Byzantine builders added massive exterior buttresses, those big thick walls sticking out from the sides to brace the building against the sideways forces earthquakes created. Plus, inside the church they cleverly added smaller semi-domes and arches around the main dome to help carry the weight and stabilize the structure. If you've ever visited Hagia Sophia and marveled at the sprawling interior, those curved half-domes aren't just pretty decorations, they're serious structural reinforcements, working overtime to keep the whole thing from tumbling down like a house of cards. But it wasn't all about brute force. The Byzantine engineers also used lightweight materials for parts of the dome to reduce the overall weight, a surprisingly advanced idea for the 6th century. Lighter bricks and mortar mixtures were employed, which helped ease the pressure on the dome's foundations. It's like swapping out heavy bowling balls for beach balls when building a giant stone tent. Clever, right? Now, these repairs and reinforcements weren't cheap or simple. They took years, required skilled artisans, and consumed vast resources: gold, marble, and human labor. The empire's coffers must have groaned under the strain. One can only imagine the Byzantine treasury clerk grimacing every time another quake hit, muttering, "No earthquake insurance? Great, just great." If earthquake insurance had existed, Hagia Sophia's premium would have been astronomical, probably enough to bankrupt an empire, or at least force a few emperors to cut back on their toga budgets. Despite these repeated shocks and fixes, the Byzantine determination was unshakable, pun intended. Hagia Sophia became more than just a building, it became a symbol of resilience. Each earthquake and subsequent repair was a testament to human ingenuity and stubbornness, the empire refusing to let nature's wrath erase its architectural jewel. Of course, the constant cycle of damage and repair also left its mark. If you look closely, the dome isn't perfectly symmetrical. There are slight irregularities, subtle signs that the building has been patched up repeatedly. It's as if Hagia Sophia is a battle-scarred veteran wearing its injuries with pride. Later on, during the Ottoman period, more restorations were undertaken after earthquakes in the 16th and 17th centuries. Each era added its own touches, but the core challenge remained: how to keep this colossal dome from folding under nature's persistent assault. The fact that Hagia Sophia still stands today, after nearly 1,500 years of tremors, is nothing short of miraculous. So next time you marvel at the soaring dome or wander the vast nave, remember, this isn't just a church or mosque or museum. It's a survivor, a building that has withstood the wrath of earthquakes, the passage of empires, and the shifting tides of history, all thanks to some of the cleverest minds of their day and an empire that refused to see its dream crumble. Nature tried to rename it Hagia Ruins, but Hagia Sophia said, "Not today," and if buildings could buy insurance, this one's policy would have been the most expensive and well-earned in history. The year was 1453, and Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was about to face one of the most pivotal moments in history. The mighty city, famed for its walls, wealth and wonders like the Hagia Sophia, was under siege by the Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Mehmed II, a leader with ambition as vast as the empire he sought to build. When the Ottoman forces finally breached the city's defenses, it wasn't just a military conquest. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter for Hagia Sophia. For over 900 years, Hagia Sophia had served as the grand cathedral of Eastern Christianity, the heart of Byzantine religious life. But now, in the hands of the Ottomans, it was about to be converted into a mosque, a transformation so complete and sweeping that it would forever alter the building's identity. Imagine taking the grandest Christian church in the world and overnight turning it into one of Islam's most important houses of worship. If that sounds like trying to turn your grandma's priceless antique vase into a bird bath, but on a scale that makes your head spin, you're not far off. The first step in this transformation was surprisingly practical. Sultan Mehmed II, who had just captured the city, needed a mosque, and fast. Hagia Sophia was the obvious choice. It was the largest, most impressive religious building in Constantinople, and its central location made it a natural candidate. Rather than demolish it or build a new mosque from scratch, the Ottomans adapted the existing structure. After all, why reinvent the wheel, especially one that was already covered in gold mosaics and marble? That said, the change wasn't just cosmetic. The conversion required several architectural and religious adjustments. The Christian icons, mosaics of saints and crosses, were either removed, plastered over, or replaced with Islamic calligraphy and art that emphasized an iconism, the avoidance of depicting sentient beings, a principle in Islamic art. Imagine going from walls covered in detailed images of Jesus, Mary, and countless saints to vast sweeping Arabic script and geometric designs. It was a massive aesthetic pivot, and a delicate one too, as both traditions respected sacred space, just in very different ways. One of the most visible changes was the addition of towering minarets. These slender, pointed towers from which the call to prayer would ring out 5 times a day were not part of the original Byzantine design. They were added gradually over the centuries following the conquest, transforming Hagia Sophia's silhouette against the Istanbul skyline. If you imagine the building as a venerable old lady, the minarets were like adding a few tall, stylish hats, unmistakably Ottoman fashion statements topping the ancient marvel. Inside, the prayer hall was reoriented to face Mecca, as is customary in mosques. This meant that certain architectural features were repurposed or altered to accommodate Islamic worship practices. For example, a mihrab, a niche indicating the direction of Mecca, was installed, alongside a minbar or pulpit from which sermons would be delivered. The vast interior, once echoing with the chants of Byzantine priests, now resounded with the melodic call to prayer and the quiet murmur of Muslim worshippers. The transformation also symbolized the Ottomans' assertion of power and cultural dominance. Taking over Hagia Sophia was more than a practical move. It was a statement to the world that the Ottoman Empire was now the heir to Constantinople's legacy. The building, once the seat of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, became a potent symbol of Islamic conquest and governance. The Ottomans didn't just conquer land, they conquered history and reinterpreted it on their terms. Interestingly, despite these sweeping changes, the Ottomans preserved much of Hagia Sophia's original architecture. They respected the building's engineering marvels and grandeur, understanding that the structure itself was a masterpiece worth preserving. This delicate balance of adaptation and conservation is one reason why Hagia Sophia remains one of the world's architectural wonders today, a hybrid monument reflecting layers of history rather than a relic frozen in time. However, this new identity wasn't without controversy or complexity. For centuries, Hagia Sophia stood as a mosque, but the Christian past was never fully erased. Mosaics and relics hid beneath layers of plaster, silently awaiting rediscovery. In some ways, Hagia Sophia became a living palimpsest, a canvas on which history was written, erased and rewritten multiple times. Of course, the transformation from church to mosque wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was about people, culture and belief. For the residents of Istanbul, then Constantinople, the building's conversion marked a profound change in daily life. The sounds drifting from the minarets replaced church bells, new religious festivals took over public spaces, and centuries-old rituals were replaced by new ones. It was as if the city itself was learning a new rhythm, one set by the prayers echoing from Hagia Sophia's towering minarets. So in summary, the grand conversion of Hagia Sophia in 1453 was a monumental event, both architecturally and culturally. It was an act of transformation that went beyond bricks and mortar, a statement of conquest, faith, and the fluidity of history. Like turning a priceless antique vase into a bird bath, it was a bold, controversial, and utterly fascinating chapter in the life of one of the world's most iconic buildings. And remember, whatever you think of the changes, Hagia Sophia's story shows us that buildings aren't just static monuments, they're living witnesses to the tides of history, forever adapting and reflecting the world around them. Once Hagia Sophia transformed from a Byzantine cathedral into an Ottoman mosque, it didn't just become a place for devout worship, it quickly turned into one of the most politically charged buildings in the entire empire. If you think today's power players hold their meetings in sleek glass towers, think again. In the Ottoman Empire, the grand echoing halls of Hagia Sophia were where religion and imperial politics did their eternal dance, sometimes beautifully, sometimes with a bit of backstabbing flair. To understand why, you need to remember that Ottoman sultans weren't just kings, they were caliphs, political rulers and religious leaders rolled into one. Controlling Hagia Sophia wasn't just about having a fancy mosque in the capital. It was about owning a powerful symbol that reinforced their divine right to rule. The building shouted, "We are the heirs to Constantinople and the champions of Islam," and everyone in the empire knew it. In many ways, Hagia Sophia functioned like a VIP club, and not the kind you get into by flashing a credit card. To get inside this club, you needed two things: a strong spiritual resume and serious political clout. Walking through those grand arches was a signal that you were either part of the elite or hoping desperately to be noticed by them. Sultans used the mosque to stage public religious ceremonies that doubled as political theatre. Imagine Grand Friday prayers attended by the entire city's elite, religious leaders, officials, military commanders, all gathering beneath the soaring dome. It was more than worship. It was a carefully choreographed performance showcasing the unity of church and state. The Sultan wasn't just a ruler, he was the embodiment of God's will on earth, and Hagia Sophia was his stage. Ceremonies inside Hagia Sophia had the precision of a royal ballet and the subtle tension of a political thriller. Officials jostled for favored seating, trying to stay visible to the Sultan. One wrong glance, one poorly timed cough, and you could find yourself out of favor faster than you could say imperial intrigue. It was a place where whispered conversations could change careers and where alliances were forged or broken in the blink of an eye. And let's not forget the role of the ulema, the religious scholars and clerics. These men were powerful gatekeepers of Islamic law and theology, and their approval was essential for the Sultan's legitimacy. Hagia Sophia was their home turf, their pulpit, and their courtroom, all rolled into one. When the ulema spoke from the minbar pulpit, it wasn't just spiritual guidance, it was political messaging, reinforcing the Sultan's authority and reminding the faithful of their duties. This delicate balancing act between spiritual leadership and political control meant that Hagia Sophia was often the epicenter of power struggles. Rival factions within the court used the mosque as a backdrop for their campaigns. Sermons and prayers were loaded with coded language, preaching obedience to the Sultan while subtly undermining his rivals. It was basically medieval political spin, delivered with the gravitas of Holy Scripture. The architecture itself played a role in these power dynamics. The vastness of the prayer hall and the soaring dome weren't just for awe, they symbolized the Sultan's grandeur and the empire's might. Standing beneath the dome was a reminder that you were literally under the Sultan's watchful eye and divine protection. It was a humbling experience designed to keep everyone in line, or at least on their best behavior during prayers. Another interesting aspect was how Hagia Sophia helped reinforce the Sultan's image as a unifier of diverse peoples. The Ottoman Empire was vast and culturally varied, encompassing Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others. By preserving Hagia Sophia and transforming it into a mosque rather than destroying it, the Sultan sent a message of continuity and tolerance. We respect this place, your history and your faith, but now we lead. It was political messaging wrapped in architectural diplomacy. In addition to religious and political ceremonies, Hagia Sophia was also a place where treaties and important state announcements were made. It was like the empire's grandest announcement board. Any proclamation issued here carried extra weight because it came from a space so charged with spiritual and political significance. If you were lucky enough to be part of those audiences, you were witnessing history, or at least the Sultan's carefully crafted version of it. Now, to lighten the mood, imagine Hagia Sophia as the ultimate VIP club, where your spiritual scorecard and political clout mattered equally. Forget dress codes. Your loyalty to the Sultan and ability to recite scripture, or at least look convincingly devout, got you in. Imagine the nervous courtiers trying to outpray and outflatter each other under that massive dome, all while subtly eyeing the guy who just got promoted. In short, Hagia Sophia wasn't just a mosque or a building, it was the beating heart of Ottoman power. A place where religion wasn't just personal faith but a political tool, a weapon and a shield, all rolled into one. The building's towering minarets and gleaming interior were more than beautiful architecture. They were symbols of an empire's grand ambitions and the precarious balancing act of holding it all together. So next time you picture Hagia Sophia, don't just see a stunning mosque, see a VIP club where prayers doubled as power plays, where every sermon could shift the course of an empire, and where political games were as sacred as the worship itself. Fast forward nearly 1,400 years from its grand Byzantine beginnings and centuries of Ottoman worship, and Hagia Sophia faced yet another dramatic transformation, this time not from one religion to another, but into something quite unexpected, a museum. The year was 1935, and Turkey was undergoing one of the most sweeping secular reforms in its history. Led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. Ataturk's vision was clear: to modernize and secularize Turkey, breaking away from the Ottoman past, and forging a new national identity based on secularism, science, and democracy. Hagia Sophia, with its layered religious history and symbolic weight, was a perfect candidate for this new chapter. Converting this grand building into a museum wasn't just about preservation, it was a political and cultural statement. The message was, here is a place that belongs to all humanity, not just one faith or empire. Turning Hagia Sophia into a museum meant that for the first time in centuries, it would be accessible to everyone, regardless of religion. People from all over the world could walk through its vast halls, admire its architecture, and witness the fascinating coexistence of Christian mosaics and Islamic calligraphy. It was, in many ways, a physical embodiment of Turkey's new secular identity, a place where the echoes of different faiths mingled peacefully. One of the most incredible aspects of this museum era was the uncovering of Hagia Sophia's hidden layers. Over the centuries, many of the Byzantine mosaics depicting Christian figures, saints, emperors, and religious scenes had been plastered over or obscured during the Ottoman period to comply with Islamic anachronism, which discourages images of sentient beings in religious contexts. But now, With the building's religious role set aside, restorers began carefully removing the plaster, revealing stunning mosaics that had been hidden for centuries. Imagine discovering a secret art gallery behind layers of dust and time. The mosaics shimmered with gold tesserae and vibrant colors, telling stories of a long-lost Byzantine era. At the same time, the building retained its magnificent Islamic elements, elegant Arabic calligraphy panels, grand minbars, and towering minarets, creating an extraordinary blend of cultures under one roof. Visitors often remarked that stepping into Hagia Sophia during the museum years was like stepping into a time machine. One moment, you'd be gazing up at the Christian images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, and the next, you'd notice the intricate Arabic inscriptions celebrating Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. It was a rare and powerful visual narrative of history's twists and turns. It was as if Hagia Sophia went on a world tour, dropped all the religious labels at the door and said, "Hey, I'm just here for the art." This attitude made it a favorite among tourists, historians, architects, and anyone fascinated by human history's messy, beautiful layers. The museum status also meant that Hagia Sophia became a symbol of cultural heritage rather than religious division. Scholars used it to study Byzantine and Ottoman art and architecture, while tourists marveled at its scale and beauty. The building's unique ability to tell stories from different faiths and empires made it an unparalleled educational resource. This period also brought about challenges, balancing preservation with tourism, managing the impact of millions of visitors, and respecting the building's spiritual significance while maintaining its secular status. Yet, despite these hurdles, Hagia Sophia thrived as a museum, continuing to inspire awe and curiosity. For 85 years, from 1935 to 2020, Hagia Sophia stood as a neutral ground, a place where history was not about division but about connection. It embodied the idea that buildings, like people, could carry many identities and stories simultaneously, each adding richness to the whole. In the annals of Hagia Sophia's storied history, few events sparked as much global debate and controversy as the decision in 2020 to reconvert this architectural marvel back into a mosque. After decades of serving as a secular museum, the building once again became a focal point where politics, religion, and international diplomacy collided, proving that Hagia Sophia's identity crisis was far from over. The origins of this decision lie deeply rooted in Turkey's contemporary political landscape. Since the founding of the secular Turkish Republic by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Hagia Sophia had symbolized a separation between religion and state. Its museum status, established in 1935, was intended to promote unity through cultural heritage, welcoming visitors from all faiths to admire its unique blend of Christian and Islamic art. But by the early 21st century, the political tides in Turkey began shifting. The ruling party increasingly embraced a more prominent role for Islam in public life and politics, signaling a desire to reconnect with Ottoman traditions and Islamic heritage. Hagia Sophia, as a monumental symbol of both, naturally came under scrutiny. In July 2020, after a controversial court ruling that annulled the 1934 decision turning Hagia Sophia into a museum, the Turkish government moved swiftly to reconvert the building into a mosque. The move was justified domestically as a restoration of national and religious pride, emphasizing the site's Islamic significance alongside its historical Christian roots. However, this reconversion was far from a simple religious ceremony. It was a powerful political statement. It symbolized a reassertion of Turkish sovereignty and identity in a region rife with historical conflicts and complex cultural narratives. The decision underscored the idea that Hagia Sophia was not just a building but a potent emblem of cultural memory and national pride. The international reaction was swift and multifaceted. Many countries and organizations expressed concern, viewing the decision as a setback for cultural preservation and interfaith dialogue. People, which had designated Hagia Sophia as a World Heritage Site, urged Turkey to ensure the protection of the building's universal value. Several Christian leaders lamented the loss of what they considered a shared sacred heritage, while others worried about the potential for increased religious tensions. Yet, supporters within Turkey hailed the decision as a rightful reclaiming of a sacred space. For many Muslims, the reopening of Hagia Sophia as a mosque was a moment of spiritual fulfillment and cultural renaissance. It became a site where faith and identity could be openly celebrated without compromise. The practical implications of the reconversion were significant. The building resumed hosting Muslim prayers 5 times a day, while still remaining open to visitors outside prayer times. This dual function required careful management to balance the religious needs with those of tourists and scholars. The challenge was to honor the building's complex history, while adapting to its renewed role as an active place of worship. On the artistic and cultural front, measures were taken to preserve the Christian mosaics and artworks during prayer times by covering them respectfully, reflecting a delicate attempt to respect all layers of Hagia Sophia's heritage. This approach highlighted the ongoing tension between honoring the past and serving present-day religious practices. The humor in this saga is hard to ignore. For over 1,500 years, Hagia Sophia has been switching identities like an indecisive Airbnb guest, hopping from room to room, each stay bringing a new decoration scheme and a new set of house rules. One might say, after all this time of religious room hopping, Hagia Sophia finally made a choice, but only after a millennium and a half of hesitation. In the grand scheme, Hagia Sophia's reconversion is a vivid reminder that buildings are not just bricks and mortar, they are living symbols entangled in the complex web of human history, politics, and belief systems. The decisions made about their use echo far beyond their walls, stirring emotions and debates worldwide. So as Hagia Sophia continues its latest chapter as a mosque, it remains a testament to humanity's enduring capacity to imbue spaces with profound meaning that evolves, conflicts, and sometimes reconciles with the relentless passage of time. Whether seen as a political move, a religious revival, or a cultural milestone, the story of Hagia Sophia reminds us that history rarely rests quietly. If Hagia Sophia were a person, it would be the ultimate makeover queen of history. Think Queer Eye meets ancient engineering. Over nearly 1,500 years, this building has had more dramatic transformations than a reality TV star, trying out new hairstyles, wardrobes, and identities. Its architecture is a living, breathing record of the countless hands and cultures that shaped it. A fascinating tapestry of Christian and Islamic influences woven into stone, glass, and gold. Let's start at the beginning, with the original Byzantine cathedral designed by Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. The architect's grand vision was nothing short of revolutionary. The defining feature of Hagia Sophia is, of course, its massive central dome, a masterpiece of engineering that was unprecedented for its time. The dome spans about 31 meters, 102 feet across, and appears to float almost miraculously above the nave, thanks to a complex system of pendentives, curved triangular supports that transfer the dome's weight onto the building's square base. This was an architectural innovation that had many contemporaries scratching their heads and wondering if the dome might suddenly collapse. Spoiler alert, it didn't, though it did require some serious repairs over the centuries. Inside, the church was an explosion of light and color. Hundreds of windows ringed the base of the dome, allowing sunlight to pour in and illuminate the golden mosaics that adorned the walls. These mosaics were more than just decorations. They told sacred stories through intricate images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, emperors and saints. The shimmering gold tesserae, tiny pieces of glass or stone, made these figures appear alive and radiant, as if they were glowing with divine light. It was less church and more heavenly art gallery, and it left visitors breathless. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, they didn't tear down this Byzantine marvel, far from it. Instead, they embraced its grandeur but adapted it to fit Islamic worship. This started a new phase of architectural evolution, turning Hagia Sophia into a mosque while preserving its stunning structure. One of the most visible changes was the addition of 4 soaring minarets at the building's corners. These slender towers were not just architectural flourishes, they served practical and symbolic purposes. From their heights, the muezzin would call the faithful to prayer 5 times a day, echoing across the city's skyline. Minarets are iconic features of Islamic architecture, and their addition gave Hagia Sophia a new silhouette, one that fused Byzantine domes with Ottoman spires in a unique blend. Inside, Christian iconography was respectfully covered or plastered over, while the walls and ceilings were adorned with grand Islamic calligraphy. Massive circular panels bearing the names of Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, and important caliphs appeared, written in elegant Arabic script. These calligraphic elements transformed the interior atmosphere, emphasizing the unity and infinity of God rather than pictorial representation. It was a bold artistic pivot, swapping detailed human imagery for sweeping, abstract designs that invited contemplation. The mihrab, a niche indicating the direction of Mecca, was installed in the apse, replacing the church's altar as the focal point for prayer. A minbar, or pulpit, was added for the imam to deliver sermons. These functional elements were beautifully integrated into the Byzantine structure, showing Ottoman architects' skill in blending new religious requirements with the old architectural fabric. Interestingly, throughout its history, Hagia Sophia's architecture also absorbed natural influences. The massive dome, while a technical marvel, required constant maintenance and adaptations, especially after earthquakes caused damage. To stabilize it, architects added supporting semi-domes and buttresses that both strengthened the structure and contributed to its distinctive aesthetic. These additions gave Hagia Sophia a dynamic, layered appearance, part cathedral, part fortress, part palace. Over time, other architectural elements were added or restored, including intricate marble columns and decorative capitals sourced from all over the empire. A veritable best-of collection of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern artistry. Each stone, each carving, told a story of the empire's vast reach and cultural richness. Even the floor mosaics, many lost or damaged, showed a mixture of Christian symbolism and later Islamic patterns, further underscoring the building's layered identity. The building's windows, carefully arranged to flood the interior with natural light, also contributed to the mystical atmosphere that has fascinated visitors for centuries. All in all, Hagia Sophia is an architectural palimpsest, bearing the marks of successive owners who respected its grandeur but made it their own. Its changing face reflects centuries of religious, political, and cultural shifts, a physical embodiment of history's ebb and flow. So if you ever find yourself staring up at Hagia Sophia's soaring dome or admiring the majestic minarets piercing the Istanbul skyline, remember you're witnessing a living story, one where Byzantine engineers met Ottoman artisans in a centuries-long collaboration, creating a building that's part cathedral, part mosque, and part masterpiece. In other words, Hagia Sophia didn't just get a makeover, it invented the art of transformation. Hagia Sophia has been a magnet for visitors for nearly 1,500 years, attracting a dazzling array of pilgrims, dignitaries, explorers, and in more recent times, selfie-snapping tourists. It's like the ultimate celebrity hotspot through the ages, but instead of flashing cameras, early visitors carried incense, prayers, or diplomatic gifts. Over the centuries, the reasons for stepping inside this iconic building have shifted dramatically, reflecting the ebb and flow of history, culture, and technology. In its earliest days as a Byzantine cathedral, Hagia Sophia was a sacred pilgrimage destination. Medieval Christians traveled great distances, often at significant personal risk, to stand beneath its soaring dome and seek spiritual solace. For them, entering Hagia Sophia was a momentous act, a chance to pray in the world's grandest church and feel closer to the divine. The massive mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and saints weren't just art, they were holy images believed to carry spiritual power. Pilgrims would marvel at the golden glow, the light filtering through countless windows, and the sheer scale of the place, often overwhelmed by a mixture of awe and reverence. These medieval visitors were often on lengthy journeys, trekking over rough terrain or crossing dangerous seas, carrying relics, offerings, or written prayers. Some chroniclers described the overwhelming experience of entering Hagia Sophia as akin to stepping into heaven itself. For many, it was a pilgrimage that could change their lives, a spiritual highlight and a deeply personal encounter with faith. As centuries passed and the Ottomans took control, the nature of visits began to shift. Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, became a central hub for Muslim worshippers and scholars. Pilgrims still came, but their prayers echoed with different rhythms, and the call to prayer from newly added minarets summoned believers 5 times daily. The building became a focal point of religious, educational, and political life in Istanbul, drawing dignitaries and visitors from across the Islamic world. Famous Ottoman sultans, poets, and travelers made pilgrimages of their own to Hagia Sophia. Some documented their visits, praising the building's grandeur and spiritual atmosphere. European travelers and diplomats also visited, often with a mix of admiration and curiosity. For them, Hagia Sophia was a symbol of the Ottoman Empire's wealth and power, a must-see landmark that bridged east and west. With the establishment of the Turkish Republic and Hagia Sophia's transformation into a museum in 1935, the visitor profile diversified dramatically. Suddenly, people of all backgrounds and beliefs could enter freely, not just as worshippers, but as cultural tourists, historians, architects, and curious onlookers. The building became a symbol of shared human heritage rather than a site tied to any one faith or empire. In the museum era, visitors flocked to Hagia Sophia to admire its architectural genius, the Byzantine mosaics painstakingly uncovered beneath centuries of plaster, and the majestic Islamic calligraphy that adorned its walls. School groups, art lovers, scholars, and international tourists wandered its halls, snapping photos and soaking in its layered history. Guidebooks highlighted it as a must-visit destination, and it featured prominently in travel documentaries and historical studies. The reasons people visited Hagia Sophia during this period were as varied as the building's own history. Some sought to connect with the past, others marveled at the artistry, and many simply wanted to experience the awe-inspiring space. It was a place to learn, reflect, and appreciate the human story through the lens of architecture and art. And then, of course, there's the modern-day visitor, armed with smartphones, selfie sticks, and a relentless desire to capture the perfect Instagram shot. For these tourists, Hagia Sophia is not just a historic monument, it's a backdrop for memories, selfies, and social media posts. The reasons for visiting may be less about salvation or scholarship, and more about sharing the experience with friends and followers online. Imagine the contrast: medieval pilgrims kneeling in silent prayer, and modern visitors posing playfully beneath the same massive dome. It's a vivid illustration of how the meaning of a place evolves with society and technology. Yet through it all, Hagia Sophia remains a place that inspires wonder and curiosity, bridging the gap between past and present. Its visitor story is a reminder that buildings are not static, they are stages for human experience, constantly rewritten by those who walk their halls. From solemn pilgrim to selfie enthusiast, Hagia Sophia has welcomed them all, proving that, no matter the century, the building holds a magnetic pull that transcends time. So next time you think about this ancient marvel, remember, it's seen prayers whispered in reverence, diplomatic negotiations sealed in grandeur, and thousands of tourists' flashbulbs popping in delight. Hagia Sophia is truly a place where history's travelers converge, each adding their own chapter to its extraordinary story. If buildings could talk, Hagia Sophia would probably throw up its hands, or at least its massive domes, and say, "Can we just pick one thing and stick to it already?" After nearly 1,500 years of flipping identities like a history book with too many plot twists, Hagia Sophia stands as history's most flexible landmark, a living, breathing testament to humanity's messy, beautiful journey through faith, culture, and politics. What makes Hagia Sophia truly remarkable isn't just its breathtaking architecture or its dizzying art fusion, but what it teaches us about coexistence and change. This building isn't a frozen relic, it's more like a chameleon, adapting its colors to survive and thrive across empires, religions, and ideologies. In an age where identity politics can sometimes divide us, Hagia Sophia offers a lesson in complexity. That history and culture are rarely neat and tidy, but full of layers and overlaps that demand respect and understanding. through Byzantine mosaics shimmering with gold and Ottoman calligraphy swirling across walls. The building encapsulates centuries of religious coexistence, not always peaceful, but undeniably intertwined. It reminds us that our past isn't a single story but a tapestry woven from many threads. Christian and Muslim, emperor and sultan, pilgrim and tourist, all have left their mark, shaping a shared heritage that transcends simple categorization. Politically, Hagia Sophia's transformations reflect shifting powers and ambitions. It's been a cathedral, a mosque, a museum, and back to a mosque again, each phase a symbol of who was in charge and what narrative they wanted to project. It's a concrete reminder that buildings often serve as more than just shelter or worship spaces. They're stages for human drama, propaganda, and identity construction. Yet, beyond all the politics and religion, Hagia Sophia endures because of its awe-inspiring presence. It draws people in, not just as a tourist attraction, but as a place where the past feels palpably alive. Standing beneath its vast dome, visitors can feel the weight of history pressing down, but also the resilience of a structure and a culture that have weathered earthquakes, empires, and revolutions. So what does Hagia Sophia teach us today? Maybe it's that flexibility and endurance are strengths. That history isn't about rigid categories but the messy overlap of stories and identities. That sacred spaces can hold multitudes, and that understanding comes from embracing complexity rather than erasing it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that sometimes it's okay to be a little indecisive. After all, it took Hagia Sophia over a millennium to settle on its current identity, and it's still the world's most famous historical shapeshifter. If buildings had a personality, Hagia Sophia would be the ultimate can't-decide friend, and honestly, that's what makes it so fascinating. So next time you gaze up at its dome or walk its echoing halls, remember, you're not just visiting a building, you're stepping into a living story of faith, power, art, and human resilience. Hagia Sophia isn't just history carved in stone, it's history still being written, one chapter at a time. If you think walking barefoot on toy bricks is painful, try being a human 40,000 years ago without shoes. Forget fluffy socks and memory foam. Your footwear was whatever nature decided to put under you that day. Jagged rocks, thorny plants, scorching sand, icy snow, and occasionally something squishy you'd rather not identify. The human foot was built to be tough, with thick calluses, strong arches, and enough flexibility to grip uneven terrain. But even the sturdiest Homo sapiens toes had their limits, and early humans discovered the hard way that unprotected feet could turn a perfectly good hunt into an impromptu limping contest. Archaeologists believe the earliest footwear wasn't exactly runway material. These were practical, no-nonsense contraptions made from whatever was lying around: tree bark, woven grasses, animal hides, or if you were lucky, scraps of mammoth skin. A pair of shoes wasn't a fashion statement. It was the difference between getting home with dinner or becoming dinner. The oldest known footwear, found in Fort Rock Cave, Oregon, dates back around 10,000 years. These were woven from sagebrush bark, think sandals, but the rustic handmade Etsy version. They weren't designed to impress anyone. They were designed to keep frostbite and splinters from ending your day early. Across the globe, different groups came up with similar solutions. Native peoples of North America used soft moccasins made from tanned hides. Siberian hunters wrapped their feet in fur to survive the frozen tundra, and ancient desert dwellers crafted flat leather soles tied on with straps to avoid third-degree burns from walking across hot sand. Why go to all this trouble? Survival. The prehistoric world wasn't just mildly uncomfortable. It was actively trying to kill you. Without shoes, hunters could slice open a foot on a sharp stone, making them slower and easier prey for predators. Cold climates brought frostbite, which could cost you toes or entire feet. And in a world where walking was your only mode of transportation, that was essentially a death sentence. Wet environments were no better. Constantly soaked feet could develop infections long before antibiotics were invented. The first humans to figure out foot protection weren't just inventing accessories, they were extending their life expectancy. And this was before the concept of left and right shoes even existed. Early designs were symmetrical lumps of material. One size fits both feet. Comfort was secondary to function, and breaking them in meant breaking in your own feet until they adapted to the awkward fit. Imagine trudging across tundra in a pair of stiff, bark-wrapped lumps that squeak every time you take a step. But when the alternative was losing a toe to frostbite, you put up with it. Of course, shoes also became tools of adaptation. In colder areas, thicker hides and furs helped trap warmth, while in tropical zones, woven sandals kept feet cool while shielding them from thorns and scorching ground. This was humanity's first real example of engineering for the environment. Footwear was custom fit, not for your personal style, but for the climate you happen to live in. It's like the world's first tech upgrade. Version 1.0 keeps you alive long enough to hunt again tomorrow. But let's not over-romanticize prehistoric footwear. These weren't glamorous, and they certainly weren't odor-free. Early shoes were often damp, musty, and lined with the sweat of a long day's chase. Without modern soap or deodorizing powder, the smell alone could probably knock out a mammoth. Yet, this didn't matter. The goal wasn't to win compliments, it was to keep your feet attached to your body. The invention of shoes also changed how humans could move. Suddenly, you could traverse harsher landscapes, hunt in deeper snow, and migrate further without destroying your feet. This gave early humans a competitive edge over predators and rival tribes. Imagine two hunting parties, one barefoot, one with crude hide moccasins. The barefoot group might have to stop after a day to heal blisters and cuts, while the shoe-wearing group kept going, covering more territory and finding better resources. In prehistoric terms, shoes were a high-tech innovation, on par with discovering fire or inventing the spear. And yes, even then, someone somewhere probably complained, "These hide wraps are too tight. The grass sandals make my feet itch. Why can't we just stay in the cave?" Human nature hasn't changed much in 40,000 years, except now we argue over whether Crocs are acceptable in public. So before we move on to the fancier, more decorative chapters of shoe history, take a moment to appreciate the humble beginnings. Those clunky bark sandals and hide wrappings were the first step, literally, in a long journey of human innovation. Without them, we might not have made it far enough to invent civilization or blister pads. Because in the Stone Age, stepping on a thorn wasn't just an annoyance, it was nature's way of saying, "Nice knowing you." If prehistoric humans were just trying not to bleed to death from a splinter, ancient civilizations took footwear to an entirely new level. By the time the great powers of the ancient world emerged, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, shoes weren't just a way to keep your feet from looking like chewed leather. They became statements of wealth, identity, and occasionally how much power you had to tell other people to do your walking for you. Let's start in ancient Egypt, a place where the climate was dry, the sand was hot enough to fry flatbread, and fashion was taken very seriously. Egyptians didn't just invent monumental architecture and elaborate burial customs. They also elevated the sandal into an art form. The most common Egyptian sandal was made from woven papyrus or palm fiber, light, breathable, and probably not much protection if you accidentally kicked a scorpion. But for the elite, especially royalty, footwear became a display of divine status. Pharaohs were sometimes buried with golden sandals, because apparently the afterlife had a very strict dress code. These gold sandals weren't meant for walking. They were a shimmering symbol of godlike authority, like saying, "I am both ruler of the land and owner of the shiniest feet in the kingdom." Egyptian artisans also understood that shoes could talk, not literally, though that would be amazing, but symbolically. Some royal sandals even had depictions of enemies on the soles, so every step the wearer took was metaphorically stomping foreign threats into the dust. Forget diplomatic negotiations. This was passive-aggressive footwear diplomacy. Over in ancient Greece, footwear had its own cultural twist. While sandals were still the go-to shoe, Greeks viewed them as more than just practical protection. The crepice, a kind of thick-soled sandal, could be tailored to the shape of the foot with adjustable straps. Leather was the favored material, often dyed in various colors. But here's the kicker. In Greek culture, going barefoot was sometimes seen as noble or even philosophical. Philosophers like Socrates were often depicted without shoes, symbolizing simplicity and disdain for material wealth. In other words, if you didn't have shoes, you might be making a profound cultural statement, or you just couldn't afford them. That being said, the Greeks didn't shy away from footwear bling. Actors in Greek theatre wore kothoni, high-soled boots to make themselves appear taller and more imposing on stage. The bigger the platform, the more important the character. It's the same principle that would later power the 1970s disco scene, except with fewer sequins and more tragic monologues. Then came the Romans, who took the sandal and militarized it. The iconic caligoi worn by Roman soldiers was a marvel of both function and intimidation. These sturdy leather sandals featured hobnailed soles, giving them grip on all terrains from muddy battlefields to the polished marble streets of conquered cities. The nails also had the added benefit of making a menacing clattering sound, so you could hear the army coming long before you saw it. Imagine the ancient equivalent of the Jaws theme, but with feet. Roman footwear also became a badge of rank. Ordinary citizens wore plain sandals solely, while senators and high officials sported more elaborate designs, often in red or black, with straps that could be identified at a glance. And then there were the calceus, a closed shoe worn by the elite that made a clear statement: I'm important enough to cover my toes. In fact, Roman law even regulated certain footwear styles, making sure no one dressed above their station. Shoes, in Rome, could literally be illegal if they were too fancy for your social class. Romans also excelled in craftsmanship. They had cobblers, suitores, who specialized in different types of shoes: sandals for the hot summer, boots, calce repandi for colder climates, and ceremonial footwear for religious events. The level of detail was astonishing: intricate stitching, dyed leather, and soles cut to fit perfectly. And like modern designer shoes, these weren't cheap unless you were a slave, in which case you wore whatever your master decided, which was often nothing at all. Footwear across these civilizations wasn't just about the physical act of walking, it was about the journey your feet represented. Egyptian sandals whispered of divine rule and the eternal afterlife. Greek sandals told tales of philosophical ideals, athletic prowess, and dramatic flair. Roman sandals clattered out the story of conquest, discipline, and social hierarchy. And it's worth noting, the majority of the population in all these civilizations still went barefoot. Shoes were expensive, and for farmers, laborers, and slaves, the idea of owning finely crafted footwear was as distant as owning a personal pyramid. Going without shoes wasn't always a choice, it was the reality of economic divide. Still, for those who could afford them, shoes were more than a necessity. They were a way to project identity. A pharaoh could command respect just by the gold glinting on his feet. A Greek actor could tower over his audience in towering kothoni. A Roman general could stamp authority into the ground with every hobnailed step. In short, the ancient sandal was more than an open-toe convenience. It was political propaganda, art, and personal branding all rolled into one. And while trends have changed, the idea of shoes as status symbols hasn't gone anywhere. We just swapped gold thread papyrus for red-soled Louboutins and hobnailed sandals for designer sneakers. The function may have stayed the same, but the drama? That's timeless. Or, as a Roman might have said while adjusting his perfectly strapped caligay, why just conquer the world when you can do it in style? If you ever find yourself walking through a medieval marketplace, the first thing you'd notice isn't the smell of roasting meat or the sight of wandering minstrels. It's the shoes, or more accurately, the weaponized fashion statements strapped to people's feet. By the 14th century, Europe had discovered the poulain, a shoe with a toe so long it could rival a fencing sword. In some extreme cases, the point stretched over 24 inches, which was about the length of a decent baguette. Practical? Absolutely not. But in the Middle Ages, practicality was something peasants worried about. Nobles, They were more interested in whether their footwear could double as a conversation starter or a trip hazard. Nobody is entirely sure which genius first decided that toes needed a dramatic extension, but the style likely came from Poland, hence the name WOULDN. Medieval fashion loved a good import. If it came from abroad, it was instantly more exotic and therefore more desirable. Soon, pointy shoes swept across Europe's courts faster than you could say mind your step. For aristocrats, the length of your shoe wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a coded social signal. The longer the point, the higher your rank. Royals and top-tier nobles could sport absurdly long points, while lesser nobles were limited to more modest lengths. Peasants, they were stuck with stubby-toed work shoes because, frankly, you can't plough a field in footwear that doubles as a jousting lance. The lower classes of the Middle Ages had no time for fashion feuds. Their shoes were functional, often little more than clunky leather turn shoes, stitched inside out, and then flipped for durability. Soles were thin and wore out quickly, especially on muddy roads, but they were cheap to replace. Many peasants went barefoot during warmer months to save wear on their limited footwear. Shoes were reserved for church, markets, and the rare occasion when you needed to impress the local reeve. The idea of wasting leather on a foot-long point, that was the kind of luxury that could feed a family for weeks. As with many trades in the Middle Ages, shoemaking was controlled by powerful guilds. These weren't just cobblers working alone in dusty workshops. They were organized craftsmen with strict rules about quality, pricing, and apprenticeships. Joining a guild meant years of training, starting as an apprentice who mostly fetched tools and swept floors. If you survived that phase without poking yourself in the eye with an awl, you could graduate to journeyman, finally allowed to make shoes under supervision. Only the best eventually became masters, opening their own shops and stamping shoes with personal maker's marks. Guilds also enforced regulations on styles, ensuring that certain designs and those coveted extra-long points remained the exclusive privilege of the upper classes. A peasant caught wearing noble-style footwear might face fines or be forced to surrender the offending shoes, which must have been awkward considering they'd have to walk home barefoot. While peasant shoes relied on rough cowhide, noble footwear was a whole different story. Soft goat or calf leather, imported silk, embroidered velvet. If it could be stitched to a sole, the wealthy would wear it. Decorations went beyond mere threadwork. Some shoes were painted with bright pigments, studded with metal accents, or even encrusted with jewels. And because medieval nobles weren't above making servants suffer for their fashion, they sometimes had them polish these delicate shoes daily, regardless of whether they'd been worn. As you might guess, extra long toes made walking tricky. To avoid tripping, wearers sometimes tied the tips to their knees with ribbons. Imagine striding into a banquet hall with your shoes lashed to your legs like some bizarre medieval safety measure. It's no wonder chronic stubbed toes were practically a noble pastime. Clergy and moralists frequently criticized the WOULDN trend, condemning it as vain and unchristian. In some regions, laws were passed to limit the maximum shoe length based on social rank. Still, as with all fashion bans in history, the restrictions only made the shoes more desirable, because nothing says I'm wealthy quite like breaking the rules in footwear. The Middle Ages were a time when social hierarchy extended all the way to your toes, literally. If your shoes were long enough to sweep crumbs off the banquet table from across the room, you'd made it. Of course, this also meant you couldn't walk through a narrow doorway without turning sideways, but such was the price of status. In many ways, medieval shoes were the original luxury cars, flashy, impractical, and prone to causing accidents. And just like today's sports cars, they weren't about getting from point A to point B. They were about making sure everyone noticed you on the way there. The Renaissance was a time when Europe collectively decided that life was far too short to wear boring shoes. After centuries of practicality being at least a faint consideration, footwear became an unapologetic celebration of artistry, luxury, and, let's be honest, showing off. This was not just about covering your feet. It was about declaring with every step, yes, I have more money than sense. and nothing symbolized this shift more than the arrival of heels, which, contrary to modern assumptions, were not invented for women. In fact, the earliest European heels were proudly worn by men, particularly aristocrats and cavalry officers, who saw them as a practical way to keep their boots locked into stirrups while riding. Of course, practicality quickly gave way to vanity. By the late 16th century, men's heels were growing higher, flashier, and less about holding your foot steady in a saddle than holding everyone's attention at court. These new heels coincided with a general explosion of decorative excess in shoe design. The Renaissance loved spectacle, and footwear was no exception. Italian cordwainers, shoemakers, experimented with vibrant dyes, silk overlays, and golden embroidery so intricate it would make a jeweler jealous. Spanish shoemakers introduced deeply tooled leather with swirling patterns, while French workshops elevated slipper making into something closer to fine tapestry weaving. There was also the strange but oddly popular fashion of slashed leather designs, where the outer layer of a shoe was deliberately cut open in decorative strips to reveal the colorful silk or velvet beneath. The more slashes, the richer you looked, and the more impractical your footwear inevitably became. For nobles and wealthy merchants, the point was not comfort. In fact, comfort was almost a dirty word. If you could afford to ruin a pair of shoes in a single evening's banquet, you had clearly arrived socially. That's why some designs barely survived contact with cobblestone streets. A walk through a damp alley could spell disaster for a pair of velvet slippers embroidered with metallic thread. But again, that was the point. Renaissance society valued display over durability, and nothing screamed status louder than owning delicate shoes you had to replace constantly. Trade was another factor fueling this footwear revolution. The Renaissance was a period of intense cultural exchange, with goods, ideas, and styles flowing between Europe, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Asia. Luxurious materials like Moroccan leather, Persian silks, and Indian cottons entered European markets, influencing not just how shoes looked, but how they were made. The pointed toe designs of the Middle Ages gave way to a variety of shapes inspired by imports from the East, including rounded toes and slipper-like profiles. Even color palettes shifted. Deep crimson, indigo blue, and saffron yellow, all made possible by imported dyes, suddenly became the height of fashion. Wearing them wasn't just stylish, it was a statement that you were connected to the vast web of international trade. In certain courts, shoes became outright works of art. In Florence, shoemakers crafted footwear adorned with pearls, gemstones, and precious metals. In Venice, platform shoes called chopines reached dizzying heights, sometimes over 20 inches tall, not because anyone needed the extra stature, but because it was a public announcement that you could afford servants to carry you if necessary. Chopines were technically a separate footwear category from the heels we recognize today, but they both sprang from the same impulse: make the shoe the center of attention, no matter the absurdity. The obsession with decorative footwear was not without critics. Religious reformers, moralists, and the occasional grumpy town official complained that overly lavish shoes encouraged vanity, extravagance, and the sort of public strutting that could only lead to sin. Some cities tried to enforce sumptuary laws restricting the height of heels or the cost of materials, but these rules were about as effective as telling a peacock to tone it down. If anything, restrictions only made fancy shoes more desirable. The more authorities frowned upon them, the more people wanted to slip their feet into embroidered confections and parade them through the piazza. Even ordinary townsfolk, while unable to afford the true luxury models, found ways to imitate the styles of the elite. A cobbler might add a small decorative slash to a leather shoe, or use a cheaper silk for lining instead of a costly imported fabric. For many, even a hint of Renaissance glamour was worth the expense. The result was a footwear culture where everyone, from dukes to apprentices, was at least somewhat aware of shoe trends and willing to spend what they could to keep up. By the end of the Renaissance, shoes had firmly crossed from being purely functional objects into fully realized fashion statements. They were shaped by military needs, artistic experimentation, and global trade, yet they were also an unmissable marker of wealth and identity. If you wanted to climb the social ladder in 16th century Europe, you could start by raising the heel on your boots, and sure, those gorgeous slashed and embroidered slippers might fall apart the moment you stepped into a puddle, but that was someone else's problem, preferably the servant following you with a dry pair, because nothing said I'm rich like shoes that could double as a work of art and couldn't survive Tuesday's rainstorm. The colonial and industrial periods marked a turning point in shoe history, when footwear stopped being just a cobbler's slow, hand-stitched art and became something the average person could actually afford, though style still depended heavily on your social rank. In these centuries, shoes reflected the needs of empires, armies, and factories, and they underwent a revolution not just in how they were made, but in how they were worn. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the world was in a perpetual state of expansion, both geographically and militarily. For colonial settlers in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, shoes were less about looking fashionable and more about keeping your toes attached in harsh climates. Sturdy leather boots, often knee-high, were the go-to choice for men hacking their way through forests, muddy riverbanks, or frost-bitten frontiers. Soldiers of the colonial armies wore boots tailored to their specific environments. Hessian boots with decorative tassels for cavalrymen, ankle boots for infantry, and waterproofed versions for naval officers who didn't want trench foot before trench warfare was even a thing. These were functional but not exactly comfortable. Thick leather could take months to soften, meaning the first weeks in new boots were basically an endurance sport for your feet. Here's the part that shocks modern shoe buyers. Before the mid-19th century, shoes didn't come in distinct left and right shapes. They were made perfectly symmetrical, which sounds convenient for production, but was pure misery for your anatomy. For centuries, cobblers would produce a straight-laced shoe, a design that could be worn on either foot because the shoe itself was identical on both sides. The idea was that over time your feet would wear in the shoes to match their own curves. In other words, the shoe wasn't adapting to you. You were adapting to the shoe, and you didn't have much choice. Most people owned only 1 or 2 pairs at a time, meaning your stiff, blobby boots had to work for everything from weddings to wood chopping. When left and right shoes finally became standard in the early to mid-1800s, it was a revelation. The difference in comfort was immediate, and factory production made it possible to implement the change without doubling the price. If you've ever sighed with relief slipping on sneakers after a long day, imagine that, but for an entire population finally able to tell their shoes apart. The Industrial Revolution brought the clatter of textile looms, steam engines, and the rhythmic punch of shoe-stitching machines. Before the 19th century, every shoe was handmade by skilled cobblers who could take days to finish a single pair. That craftsmanship was beautiful, but slow, and the working poor often had to make do with patched-up, worn-out footwear for years. By the 1850s and 1860s, innovations like the sewing machine and specialized shoemaking equipment changed everything. The Mackay stitching machine, invented by Lyman Blake in 1856, could attach soles to uppers at lightning speed compared to handwork. This meant shoes could be produced in bulk, drastically lowering the price and making them accessible to more than just the wealthy. Factories also introduced standardized sizing. Before that, sizes were more approximate suggestions than reliable measurements. Now shoes could be sold ready-made in shops rather than having to commission a cobbler for every new pair. While machine-made shoes weren't as individually beautiful as bespoke ones, they were durable enough to survive the factory floor, the battlefield, or the muddy colonial streets. Industrial laborers needed shoes that could endure long hours on unforgiving surfaces. Iron-shod clogs became common in some factory towns, particularly in Britain, where the wooden sole and reinforced toe could withstand constant wear and protect against falling tools. In mining communities, sturdy leather boots with hobnail soles were a must, their metal studs giving extra grip in slippery tunnels. For dock workers, waterproofed boots or heavy galoshes were essential, while rural laborers stuck to ankle boots with laces or buckles. These designs emphasized practicality over fashion. No one cared if you were stylish when your job involved dodging coal carts. The upper classes of the colonial and early industrial eras still wore footwear as a status marker. In the 18th century, Wealthy men sported polished leather shoes with gleaming buckles, sometimes silver, sometimes jeweled, while women wore delicate slippers made of silk or brocade, utterly useless for walking outside. By the 19th century, wealthier Victorians adopted the ankle boot as a fashionable statement, with elastic side gussets for convenience and polished leather finishes for show. These were ideal for strolling along clean, paved promenades, less ideal for anyone outside the bubble of industrial prosperity. The most amusing fact about shoes in this era is still that left and right feet were basically an afterthought until the 1800s. For generations, humanity simply shrugged and said good enough, while cramming toes into shapeless leather lumps. The industrial age gave us many things: steam power, railways, mass production. But for your feet, the real miracle was simply letting them point in their own separate directions. In other words, before the 19th century, your feet were the ones doing the adjusting. Now at least it's the shoes that have to meet you halfway. If the 19th century was about shoes becoming standardized and affordable, the 20th century was about them becoming loud, flashy, and as much a part of identity as the hair on your head, except you could change them more often. This was the age where your shoes could tell people who you were, where you came from, and even what music you listened to. And they didn't whisper it, they shouted. The early 1900s still clung to sensible laced boots and leather Oxfords for men, with women's footwear moving towards slimmer heels and decorative buckles. But change was on the horizon, and as it turns out, nothing motivates fashion like 2 world wars and the arrival of mass media. World War I and II didn't just change geopolitics, they rewired our closets. In the trenches, soldiers wore sturdy, ankle-high boots with hobnails for grip and thick leather for protection, and after the wars, these styles marched straight into civilian life. Military surplus stores became the shoe racks of post-war youth. The combat boot was reborn as everything from a worker's staple to a punk rebellion symbol. In World War II, rubber rationing meant practical footwear became even more practical. Leather shoes replaced rubber-soled options, and women often wore wedge heels made of cork or wood. The war effort even spawned a fashion workaround: utility shoes, government-approved designs with low heels, plain styles, and minimal decoration. They were simple, durable, and according to many, a visual crime against ankles. The most game-changing footwear of the 20th century didn't come from a Paris runway, it came from a basketball court. Sneakers, or plimsolls as they were first known, had existed since the late 19th century, but in the early 20th century, brands like Converse, Keds, and later Adidas and Puma turned them into cultural icons. The 1920s saw the Converse All-Star become the shoe of choice for athletes. By the 1950s, thanks to basketball star Chuck Taylor and the rise of youth culture, sneakers were no longer just for sports. They were a symbol of rebellion, the anti-dress shoe. Teenagers paired them with jeans, and parents sighed deeply into their evening newspapers. In the 1970s and 80s, sneaker culture exploded. Adidas tracksuits and Puma sneakers were flaunted by hip-hop pioneers, while Nike turned sports endorsement into an art form with the Air Jordan line in 1980. Suddenly, sneakers weren't just shoes, they were collectibles, status symbols, and a reason for people to camp outside stores at 4 a.m. While sneakers brought comfort to millions, high heels marched on, and sometimes up in height. The stiletto heel, introduced in the 1950s, was a marvel of engineering and a menace to cobblestone streets. The 1980s saw power dressing take over, and shoes followed suit. Women in corporate offices wore sharp pumps as part of their armor, projecting authority with every click-clack down marble hallways. Meanwhile, disco-era platform shoes defied logic and ankle stability, allowing wearers to dance 3 inches closer to the ceiling. Footwear became tied to subcultures like never before. Doc Martens, once a humble German work boot, became the go-to shoe for punks, skinheads, and later grunge musicians. Cowboy boots moved from ranches to rock concerts. Loafers went from preppy Ivy League staples to Wall Street uniforms. Even jelly sandals, those translucent plastic summer shoes that looked like gummy candy, had their moment of childhood glory in the 80s and 90s, squeaking across playgrounds worldwide. Footwear also reflected social movements. In the 1960s, the women's liberation movement embraced more practical shoes, often rejecting heels altogether. The hippie movement preferred sandals and moccasins, the kind of shoes you could wear to both a music festival and a protest march. By the late 20th century, globalization had turned footwear into a truly global business. A sneaker might be designed in the US, manufactured in Southeast Asia, and marketed through an ad campaign filmed in Europe. Fast fashion brands began churning out runway-inspired designs at lightning speed, making once luxury styles available for the price of a decent dinner. Advertising budgets ballooned. Brands didn't just sell shoes anymore, they sold lifestyles. Nike told you to just do it. Reebok wanted you to be more human. Manolo Blahnik sold not just heels, but the fantasy of living in a New York penthouse. Some trends defied all logic. Moon boots, those puffy, astronaut-inspired winter boots, turned snowy streets into makeshift lunar surfaces. In the early 2000s, minimalist barefoot running shoes claimed to improve your posture and return you to your natural gait, ignoring the fact that most people's natural gait wasn't designed for running on asphalt. The funny thing about the 20th century, it proved that shoes could be comfortable, stylish, or practical, but rarely all three at once. You could have the coziness of sneakers, the elegance of heels, or the durability of work boots. But if you wanted them all in one, you were probably designing footwear for a science fiction film. By the end of the century, shoes weren't just protecting feet, they were telling stories. They revealed class, culture, even personality type. And as the new millennium approached, the world had an entire century's worth of shoe styles to remix, reinvent, and occasionally regret. The human relationship with shoes has always been a mix of necessity, style, and occasionally masochism. But as we step into the 21st century's technological fast lane, footwear is no longer content to just keep your toes warm and the gravel out. Instead, shoes are evolving into something that might be part fashion statement, part gadget, and part eco-friendly manifesto. In the coming decades, the question may not be what shoes should I wear, but what do I want my shoes to do for me today? Imagine walking into a shoe store, scanning your feet, and watching a printer spit out the perfect pair of sneakers before you finish your latte. That's not science fiction anymore. It's Tuesday in the world of 3D printed footwear. Companies like Adidas, Nike, and smaller upstarts have already toyed with shoes that are printed on demand, reducing waste and eliminating the need for massive warehouses of unsold sizes. The tech allows for unprecedented customization. Arch height, heel cushioning, even the exact squishiness of your sole could be tailored to your stride. The catch? Well, until home 3D printers stop costing more than a small car, you might still need to let someone else do the printing for you. For decades, the average shoe has been a cocktail of plastics, glues, and synthetic fabrics that could probably survive the apocalypse. But as climate change forces industries to rethink production, footwear is going green in a serious way. Plant-based leathers made from mushrooms, pineapples, or cacti are already stepping into the market. Pun absolutely intended. Biodegradable sneakers promise to break down in compost heaps instead of landfills. Some brands are even experimenting with closed-loop systems. Send your worn-out shoes back and they'll grind them down to make the next batch. Of course, the dream of a guilt-free shopping spree still has hurdles. Sustainable often means slightly more expensive, and convincing people to care about a shoe's carbon footprint can be tricky when it's competing with glittery high tops. Wearable technology has conquered wrists, ears, and even glasses, so naturally the next frontier is your feet. Smart shoes equipped with sensors can already track your steps, posture, speed, and even calorie burn with more accuracy than your average fitness band. Runners can get real-time feedback on their gait to prevent injuries, while elderly wearers might have fall detection alerts sent straight to caregivers. Some prototypes go further, embedding haptic feedback for navigation. Your left shoe vibrates to tell you to turn left, your right to turn right. There's even talk of shoes that could charge your phone through kinetic energy as you walk. Of course, there's also the risk your sneakers will need a software update before you can leave the house. Here's a conflict older than the stiletto. Should shoes serve your feet, or should they serve your ego? Designers are split between pushing ergonomic innovations, wide toe boxes, better shock absorption, arch support magic, and chasing bold, sometimes gravity-defying styles that defy common sense and podiatry advice. The coming decades might not resolve the tension, but they may make it more interesting. Augmented reality could allow you to wear outrageous designs digitally for social media, while your actual feet are safely tucked into something supportive and sane. Still, there's always going to be someone willing to suffer for fashion, even if their smart shoes are sending distress signals to a podiatrist. Historically, shoes have been cultural markers from medieval poulains to hip-hop sneaker culture, and that won't change anytime soon. In the future, they might become even more of a social signal. Imagine political statements embedded in your footwear materials, or shoes that change color based on your mood, or your Spotify playlist. Minimalist barefoot shoes might rise as a statement against over-engineering, while high-tech statement sneakers could become the new luxury handbags. As virtual spaces grow, digital-only shoes could be bought, worn, and displayed entirely in the metaverse. No blisters, no dirt, just pure flexing. Let's be honest, there's a real chance that in 50 years your shoes will be more capable than your first smartphone and still manage to annoy you. They'll track your every step, order replacements automatically when the tread wears thin, and maybe even nag you when you've been sitting too long. They could heat up in winter, cool down in summer, and light up when you're crossing the street. Yet somehow, they'll still pinch your toes, because while humanity may advance technologically, there's one timeless truth. Even the most futuristic footwear can't stop a blister. If the past century taught us that shoes could be a playground for creativity, comfort, and sometimes questionable choices, the future promises an even wilder ride. Whether we end up in biodegradable moon boots, AI-powered loafers, or holographic heels, one thing is certain: our feet will continue to walk us into the next chapter of fashion, technology, and human eccentricity. And maybe, just maybe, they'll do it without squeaking.